Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners. Everyone, welcome to the Hog and Hound Bar, said Rudy Rakinski, the bar manager. A round-faced man with a blushing face that was so pink it looked like he'd recently got burnt in the sun, which was definitely not the case, for indeed his face was always pink. Behind the scenes, when people talked about him, they would refer to him rather unkindly as Pinkface, which was unfortunate, but the name seemed to stick, as everyone knew exactly who you were talking about. By all accounts, he was a jovial, rather jolly man, with a huge, vibrant sense of humour that equally matched his large, extended belly, that had been acquired from knocking back way too many beers over the years. He had congenial, deep-set bull-terrier chocolate-brown eyes that twinkled with merriment, and a very amenable disposition, so he was well liked by all the locals. He spoke in a deep voice that definitely commanded respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention?" The raised voices in the bar became hushed as he began to speak. "I'm delighted to introduce you to Miles Fackerman, who is an acclaimed, venerated, highly praised stand-up comic. We go back a long, long time together, when we were in our 20s. So we have a colourful history behind us. But the less said about that, I think, the better. At the time, I tried my hand at being a stand-up comic for a while. But I hasten to say, I wasn't very good. I guess I got the most awful stage fright. My nerves got the better of me. Plus, my jokes were rather lame. Insipid and wishy-washy, I think. So I almost certainly got booed off the stage. People were brutally unkind back then. They wouldn't put up with squirming, insecure comics that floundered, blundered, or writhed on their words, like I invariably did. People lost patience then. So I was spurned and spat out, if you like, because I didn't pass the grade. I didn't have the audacious iron stomach for all those knockbacks and rejection. But the plucky, indomitable Miles Fackerman here most certainly did. He was made of far braver, tenacious and resolute stuff than I was. From day one all those years ago, he stood up fearlessly in front of the audience. Everyone loved him. So if anyone can give you a skip to your step tonight, it's no other than the great Miles Fackerman. So I have great pleasure tonight to introduce you to one of Seattle's most loved stand-up comics. He knows how to make you laugh like you've never laughed before. Thank you everyone for coming here to the Hog and Hound Bar tonight. If you haven't been here before, you are more than welcome. Our illustrious chef Marco Fontaine has a James Beard Award behind him, so don't hesitate to dine out on our exclusive menu. You will not be disappointed. There's also a 25% discount on all our colourful cocktails. Tonight, all the money we are raising is going to the Seattle Animal Shelter, so we will be exceedingly grateful for any extra donations you make to our little furry friends, of which most people here tonight are very eager to support. Everyone cheered as Miles Fackerman nodded his head. Yay! Yay! The Hog and Hound Bar in Seattle was always busy, but no more so than on this auspicious night, as animal lovers all over the county were bustling enthusiastically to order their drinks, while some people sat at tables surrounded by grandiose, rather sumptuous red velvety gold-striped upholstered chairs. They were eagerly ordering the delectable mouth-watering food from the excellent extensive first-class menu, from which to date there had rarely been any complaints. The special of the day was grilled octopus over squid ink pasta with garlic and tomato sauce, or brown butter risotto with lobster. The sanguine, buoyant mood of the bar was animated, as male and female garrulous chatter was hoisted over the background noises, rather like a huge white sail blowing in a headwind, which is a very lovely feeling indeed. You could hear the clink of glasses, the tinkle of ice swirling around in colourful cocktail martini glasses with their little umbrellas and cocktail sticks strewn with exotic fruits, along with the clicking sound of the jukebox being injected with coins to produce more upbeat music that energised and electrified the already animated, fortified mood in the bar. Some rather inebriated, high-spirited people were gyrating their hips in time to the music, waving their glasses flamboyantly in the air, singing with ecstasy, as all inhibitions had been unleashed, rather like a horse being freed to run wild over the pastures without being shackled to its bitten reins. The bar manager, Rudy, was telling everyone to be quiet, as Miles Fackerman began his stand-up comic show. It was difficult to hush an intoxicated, tempestuous crowd, as with 20% off the drinks that night, people had gone wild with their orders. Unless you were teetotal, you were pretty much caught under the infectious allure of those ravishing drinks that created a somewhat raucous frenzy, that rather like a feral wildfire could not be easily tamed or subdued, as most people in the bar were staggering around precariously, as if the scaffolding of their own legs was failing to support their bodies in an upright vertical position. Miss Elisa Lamonte was sitting in the corner oakwood table, with about 20 of the locals that lived within 15 minutes of her farmhouse in a rural, rather remote area outside of Seattle. She had actively encouraged them to come along to the bar in her large minivan. She was exceedingly passionate about supporting the animal shelter. She called herself a canophile, which means very much a dog lover. At one time in her life she'd started a rescue centre for greyhounds. She was an attractive-looking woman in her early 60s, with a very good flawless complexion, a wild thicket of white hair that she tied up in a knot on her head. But most of her hair seemed to have a mind all of its own, was hanging loosely around her face in messy rat's tails that could not be tamed, which was contrary and incongruous with her very ordered Puritan personality. She commonly boasted that the last time she'd actually visited a hairdresser was when she was in her early 20s. It almost certainly showed. She wore a tangle of bright colourful scarves around her neck. Her rather voluptuous Rubenesque body was tightly contained in a black sequenced dress that glittered with thousands of sparkling rhinestone jewels, about 5 sizes too small for her, seemingly holding her jiggly bits together like a tight corset, which made many people secretly wonder if the poor woman could actually breathe. Everyone seemed to be having a marvellously good time, but most people were completely plastered, with the glorious cocktails being so cheap. It was very easy to get caught up in the moment, go extravagantly overboard, indulging beyond the threshold of what may be considered reasonable and safe alcohol levels. Bobby Finnegan and Carter Botting got caught up in a bladdered drunken brawl. 2 of the guests that Alicia had invited to the comedy show. Now they had become the show. Soon the stand-up comic was overshadowed by the 2 inebriated men that were throwing their fists at each other, while everyone was cheering on, almost as if they thought the drunken brawl was all part of the comedy act, which they found hilarious and cleverly done, failing to realise that it actually was a genuine fight. "I'll bloody kill you," said Bobby. "He said my wife was a fat, stupid cow," he told the audience. "Did you hear that? He called my wife a fat, stupid cow. No one calls my wife a fat, stupid cow. No one, do you hear that?" In defiant retaliation, Bobby chided, Your wife looks like a man. Your wife looks exactly like a man. She's got hair on her chin. She's growing her beard." The crowd cheered, teasing Carter Botting. One man piped, "Your wife is growing a beard. That's got to be way worse than being a fat cow." At that, Carter became incensed. He began oscillating his arms around like an angry, indignant octopus, but he kept striking the air, as his coordination was way off the mark. His futile attempts to fight back got the crowd clapping and cheering in delight. Carter's face grew crimson with rage. His rounded hazel eyes looked furious. His jaw was clenched very tightly. "My wife, I'll have you know, my wife is not growing a beard." Then it was his turn to pipe something nasty again. Your wife, she stinks. She smells of chip fat. She smells of ship fat and grease. She smells greasy." "Well, that's 'cause my wife can cook. Yours can't make anything without burning it into a cinder. My missus says your wife is the worst cook in the world. The worst cook. I stuffed the sausages in my pocket that she made. They were as hard as rocks. Inedible! Inedible! You hear that?" "Hear that?" cried one man. "Your wife's cooking stinks. No one wants a wife who can't cook." At that, everyone in the bar cheered, and Carter finally managed to push Bobby on the floor. They were fighting each other like two rabid dogs, with fists hitting the floor with very cloddish manoeuvres. They were clumsy but comical to watch. The applause escalated as people took sides, some shouting for Carter, others for Bobby. "Right, I've had enough," said Alicia, going up to the two men, kicking them with her bright, shiny, black high-heeled court shoes. "Get up, the two of you! Stop this fighting at once! I've had enough of it!" Everyone in the bar shouted, "Stop the fighting! Stop the fighting! Stop the fighting!" But it was more like a chant. Alicia pulled the two men onto their feet, slapping their faces indignantly. "I brought you here tonight to have a great time, to support an animal charity. But look how you've let me down. You've brought shame on our whole group. Instead of looking like upstanding American citizens, we look like a bunch of loutish thugs or hooligans. Honestly, when are the two of you ever going to grow up?" Indeed, Alicia was so enraged, hot under the collar, she informed the rest of the group that they were going at once. They were leaving now, ASAP. Most of her group were 3 sheets to the wind, tiddly, gin-soaked, completely trolleyed. They were giggling at everything, finding the most minuscule, absurd, rather mundane, commonplace things terribly amusing, like the scarves that Alicia was wearing, that one of the drunk ladies described as upmarket dish rags, which everybody found terribly funny, with the exception, of course, of Alicia, who was far from amused. The group was promptly escorted by Alicia out of the bar, while everyone cheered, as if they were praising a comedy show. "That was the best comedy performance ever," came one man's voice. "It was bloody brilliant. Even if I say so myself, you rarely had us fooled." Everyone clapped, nodding their heads in agreement. "Best comedy act ever," they all agreed. Alicia was thinking privately to herself that the humiliating performance between the two best friends had been anything but a comedy show. But if that is what the audience of the Hog and Hound customers thought it was, all well and good. In truth, when Bobby and Carter got into a drunken altercation, it could be terribly funny to watch, although when things went too far, they often got out of hand. On one occasion, Bobby had ended up in accident and emergency with a broken nose, a dislocated jaw, 4 missing teeth. Surprise, surprise, what had the fight been over? Their wives, of course. I mean, what else would it possibly be? Having a dig at each other's wives was too close for comfort. It was always personal, a bone of contention for both men. It would rile them up considerably, causing them to lash out at each other. It was as if a snipe at their wives was a personal attack on them. They immediately would leap to their wives' defence. Normally the two men were the very best of friends, but throw a few drinks their way, invariably the knives would come out, the forked snake-like tongue spitting out derogatory words, the deadly venomous rattles of some misplaced punches that left both men on many occasions ever so slightly beaten up, with, of course, the occasional trip to accident and emergency. But did these two men ever learn from their catastrophic mistakes or incredulous blunders when faced with their sobriety? Absolutely not. Of course they would go through the motions of apologising profusely afterwards to each other, confessing that every nasty word that came out of their mouths was just the drink speaking, nothing else. But in secret, in the cold, hard, cruel light of day, the two men would secretly ponder if many words spoken in jest had a ring of truth to them. Carter would wonder if Bobby had really stuffed his wife's sausages in his pocket, and Bobby would wonder if his wife did smell of chip fat. "It's such a bummer," said Mrs. Landon, giggling uncontrollably, as she sat at a seat next to her husband in the minivan, wrapping the safety belt around her petite form. The normally dignified, aloof woman had allowed her inhibitions to wither away this evening, as she, like many of the others in the group, had drunk far too much. I was really enjoying myself this evening," she told her husband, "until Carter and Bobby got into a drunken brawl together. They completely spoiled the evening for the rest of us. But everyone at the bar thought it was part of the comedy act. They just lapped it up. They loved it. But I knew it was a joke." "Well, we did have an exceedingly good dinner, didn't we?" her husband reminded his wife, taking her hand encouragingly in his, giving it a tight, affectionate squeeze. "Let's not kid. That octopus with the black noodles was delicious. I can't say I'm remotely surprised that the chef has got a James Beard Award." "Is everyone here?" asked Alicia, whom in her younger days had been a school headmistress for an upmarket girls' school in Seattle. But she involuntarily acted as if she was still one, as once you're used to ordering people around, it can become ingrained in your psyche, and Alicia loved nothing better than putting people firmly in their place, lecturing them about how things should be done. At the junior high school where she'd been headmistress, she had a formidable reputation, known as the Woman of Iron. "Is everyone here?" she said, calling out the name she had written on her list. "Just say present if you are." No one seemed to mind Alicia's bossiness, as going out for a drink on the town without worrying about driving was a huge bonus for the 60-year-olds, whom had been invited to the bar this evening in order to support the animal charity. The best thing of all about Alicia was she never drank a single thing. For her, losing control was like a deadly sin. But to her friends, Alicia's sobriety was a huge advantage when it came to receiving a safe lift home. "Right, Bobby," said Alicia, "you're sitting here in the front with me. I don't want you and Carter getting into another altercation together. I've had about as much as I can take of the two of you." "Right, is everybody ready?" she said. "Please put your safety belts on. We're going now." Alicia put on some trendy upbeat music. The minivan started up. She pressed down the accelerator pedal, sailing through the bright twinkling lights of Seattle. By all accounts it was a quiet Friday night, late in the evening. There weren't many cars on the road, although there were a few slosh-looking people on the streets, staggering back to their downtown apartments. Everyone in the minivan began to sing to the music happily. Alicia groaned to herself, swearing that next time there was a charity occasion at the bar, she would not be inviting Bobby and Carter along for the ride. Those two, whenever they were stoned, got completely out of control. She found herself thinking of the two men, rather like former pupils at her school in her heyday, when she was a headmistress. She had been a great draconian disciplinarian in those days. How she wished she could place those two men under detention. Pity they were way too old for that, she thought. Alicia privately thought to herself that she would invariably take some of the back rural roads. She knew a quicker way back to her rustic farmhouse. She had never attempted this journey before at night, and was oblivious to how challenging it would actually be. She hadn't bargained for the fact that everything would look so unfamiliar and alien to her when there were no street lights on. for what seemed easy to navigate during the light of day was like a befuddling obstacle course at night. Indeed, with only the lights of her minivan, as well as a somewhat obscure full moon, complemented by a tenebrous night that was almost impossible to see where she was actually going. Of course, being on rough roads not lined with asphalt meant that her van jolted and jiggled all the way, her well-worn rubber tyres spraying up large volumes of dust and tiny pebbles that kept tinkling against the aluminium carcass of her van. For Alicia, the landscape all looked exactly the same. She began to privately worry that she might be getting hopelessly lost, but that was not something she was willing to divulge with any of her friends in the minivan, who were blindly oblivious and too half-cut to really even care, which in itself was a monumental blessing. In their sobriety, her friends would have lost patience with her tonight. Alicia was an exceedingly proud woman, who fancied herself as always being in control, the kind of person you would take with you to a remote desert island, as she would hold it together so tightly, remain as cool as a cucumber in precarious situations, slow to lose her nerves or get flustered, and tonight was no different. Everywhere she looked there were dense silhouettes of tall statuesque trees, namely ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, clustered together in congenial groups under a dark, inky sky, although at night the trees did not look congenial at all, as the slight wind that was blowing through the needled boughs caused them to sway in such a way it was almost as if the trees themselves were shaking their heads at her in a gesture of extreme displeasure, whispering to her that she wasn't welcome in these parts. Alicia shivered in trepidation, wishing she hadn't taken a shortcut home, but had chosen to take a straightforward road back to her home, where everyone would be staying overnight in her large farmhouse that boasted over 8 bedrooms. Her guests' trucks were parked in the parking bay at her farmhouse. In the morning they would drive back to their homes once the alcohol had gone through their system. She had in mind to prepare a fabulous breakfast for all her guests in the morning. Bacon, eggs, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes and toast, served with fresh orange juice and tea. She could hear her guests singing in the back of her van, in an intoxicated state, while some had fallen fast asleep and were out for the count. She was beginning to realize she was driving around in circles, retracing her steps over and over again, taking all the wrong turnings in the road. Those were the days when the privilege of GPS and cell phones were a long way in the future, as this was 1985. Suddenly Alicia realized her van had run out of petrol. She had overlooked filling up the tank, falsely assuming she had enough petrol to get everyone back safely to her property. But driving around in circles for over an extra hour or two had almost certainly drained her tank. The van came to a sudden stop, refusing to move forward or budge even an extra inch. Why had the truck stopped? "What is the problem, Alicia? Why has the truck suddenly stopped?" asked Mr. Landon. He was unclasping his safety belt, moving through the sea of sleeping bodies towards the front of the minivan. He was the only man that could drink like a fish and remain sober. Alicia's face grew crimson with embarrassment. She felt incredibly humiliated. "I didn't realise I didn't have enough petrol in the tank," she whispered. "The truth is, Alec, I'm awfully lost. I don't know where the hell I am. It's so dark out there. Everything looks exactly the same. I thought I was going to take a shortcut, but I've been driving around and around in circles. I don't know where the heck I am." "Never you mind," said Alec, detecting the rising level of anxiety in Alicia's voice, something he had never been privy to before, as the woman had nerves of steel, the hide of a rhino. "This can easily happen. The back roads here can be very, very deceptive. I've got lost myself before in the past. Never you mind, Alicia. Everyone is far too plastered to know what's going on. I'll get my wife to keep everyone calm if anyone should wake up. I tell you what, I'll try and find out where we are. I'll walk back to your house. I've got some petrol in the back of my truck. I'll go and get it for you and bring it here." "But do you have a clue where we are?" "No, I don't, but I'll find out. I'm sure I will. It can't be that difficult. I notice you have a torch in the truck. I'll take that. I'm sure I'll find my way back to the house, so don't you worry your pretty face about anything, Alicia." "Are you sure, Alec?" That would be such an enormous help. You're such a star. Thank you so much. What's going on? Came a drunken voice in the back. Why have we stopped? Has anyone got any more margaritas for me? Never you mind, said Felicia. We've just had a slight problem. Everything's going to be sorted out in a moment. The good news is that the people in the minivan appeared to be too inebriated to pay any attention to what was going on, which was a huge relief. Alec Landon's account. Apart from Alicia, it would seem I was the only one not completely bladdered in the minivan. We had all gone too far at the bar, drinking way too much. Even my wife, Ruth, had not stopped giggling most of the way. It had been years since I'd seen her like this, all because of a 25% discount on the drinks, which no one could resist. I'd never seen my wife ordering so many exotic cocktails before. She was just in her element. She ordered Cold Fashioned, which was whiskey with coffee liqueur. Then she ordered Firecracker, which was bourbon with grapefruit juice, port and raspberries. Then she ordered Black-Eyed Rye, which was a Sagamore Spirit rye with lime juice, ginger beer, blackberry syrup and mint leaves. And then she ordered some pinhookers, which consisted of pinhook rye, iced tea, lemon syrup, lemon juice and mint leaves. I'm not sure what the others in our group ordered, but let's just say we all went overboard. I was the one that stuck to my craft beers, but was fortunate to be able to handle my drink. Yet even as I climbed out of the minivan with a torch in my hands, I did feel somewhat overwhelmed by the velvety black night, the tall silhouettes of the trees, the stretches of the long dirt road that lay ahead of me. Much like Alicia, despite the fact that I'd driven up and down these roads for over 20 years, I truly couldn't fathom where we actually were. Granted, I was a lot more sober than most, but I hadn't escaped some of the disadvantages of an alcoholic brain. I felt a little foggy and less stable on my feet, which didn't help me at all. I could not for the life of me comprehend why someone as clued up, shrewd and savvy as Alicia could be so ignorant, naive, impetuous and incautious as to risk taking a shortcut in her minivan down some of these rather dicey, dodgy lanes that can be very confusing, rather like a maze, where you can get horribly lost. Everyone in these parts knows this to be a fact. They know it's unheedingly reckless, precipitous, extremely ill-advised to be impulsive and to be daredevil-like in taking shortcuts at night. But then again, the complacent, smug Alicia had always placed herself above the hoi polloi in society, seeing herself as an altogether different breed to the common man, rather like Amelia Earhart, the first female to fly solo across the Atlantic. On many occasions, Alicia had drawn reference to the woman, describing herself in the same context as the esteemed pilot. "I feel like we're both peas in a pod," she would exclaim. "Indeed, if reincarnation is true, I would say without a shadow of a doubt that in my former life I was Amelia Earhart." The truth about this minivan trip is that what should have taken us a mere 20 minutes had taken a couple of hours. I made a note of where Alicia's minivan was parked. I continued to walk down the road heavily strewn with stones, and of course the occasional pothole, which meant on a couple of occasions I tripped and nearly took a big tumble. There was a cool southerly breeze blowing through the tall vertical trees that penciled up into the sky like formidable hostile giants. I say hostile, as the ambience of this bodeful, inauspicious night felt distinctly unfriendly. I was surprised to realise how quiet it actually was. Now let me assure you, when things are very still, the stillness has a distinct sound all of its own, a chilling sound that pierces through your very core like a sharp knife plundering through your chest. It's an uneasy feeling that niggles at you, whispering into your ears like a ghostly ethereal voice, without audible distinguished words, but you can hear them, as every cell of your body is alert, responsive to what you're perceiving in your environment. Without the normal chirping sounds of the crickets or the croaking of the frogs, I was very aware that something was very wrong. My father had always warned me as a young boy that when a place grows ominously quiet, there could potentially be a predator lurking around. It left me with chills meandering down my spine. I sensed that something was watching me. But then was it my imagination being just over-creative? With just my tweed jacket on for protection, I could feel the icy wind biting me with freezing chills that meant I stepped up my speed to keep as warm as I could. I certainly could not have navigated my way down this road without Alicia's torch, so I was ever grateful for small mercies, if there were any on this night. I glanced up at the velvety sky, marvelling at its inky blackness. The moon seemed almost veiled by a misty cloud cover, while the silvery stars, normally so bright and twinkling, looked dim, dull, and inconspicuous. As I trudged down the road, surrounded on either side by hilly grassy embankments, fringed by tall Douglas fir trees, I could hear something was following me. I knew I wasn't mistaken. It sounded like bipedal footsteps, not what you would expect to hear from a mountain lion, but the heavy feet decimated, pulverizing leaves and sticks beneath hardened soles. You could hear the twigs crunching, snapping, and popping. Whatever it was plundered the ground with a thunderous footfall that gave me the distinct impression that my stalker had to be ponderous, very substantial in size. I glanced around nervously, my eyes drawn to the trees. I watched for any sign of movement, but I heard and saw nothing. I quickly increased my pace, finding a stick on the ground to use in self-defence. But as I moved, so did this thing that was clearly following me. It sounded as if the ground was groaning every time it picked up speed. When I slowed down, so did it. When I stopped, so did it. And when I increased my speed, so did it. Now I was really feeling frantic. I could feel my hackles rise. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. When I reached the end of the road, where there were two pronounced forks, I didn't know whether to turn left or right. I felt bewildered, very confused. I actually said out loudly, "Damn, where the hell am I? Do I turn left? Do I turn right? What the heck do I do?" I decided the left-hand turn looked more familiar. I was about to make the turn when I heard a strange roaring sound that was so discomposing it sent chills racing down my spine. What the hell was that? The daunting noise was more formidable and alarming than a lion's roar, and I say that without a hint of exaggeration. That was when I saw it. It came thundering through the trees at one hell of a mighty speed. When you see something monstrously huge bounding towards you, your first reaction is, "No, this can't be real. This is not happening. This must be the drink talking." Everything was so surreal to me that my fear was suspended, almost as if it had been held back for a while, so that I could gain some sense of perspective over what was transpiring. I realized at once that this figment of my imagination was not a spurious creature of fantasy fiction, but a real breathing creature. Then it hit me like a blinding revelation, almost as if you've walked into a dark room, fumbled around in the darkness, but when you reach for the light switch, you know what you're observing. The light reveals it clearly to you. So the thing you thought was a bookshelf, you realized was a bureau. The thing you thought was a couch, you realized was a futon. It was obvious to me that this extraordinary anomalous creature was a Bigfoot. This was hard for me to digest, assimilate, or even swallow. Maybe the universe has a sense of humour. I felt as if the Bigfoot was laughing at my nonplussed expression. It was almost as if he sensed how stunned I was to see him. It was almost as if he was saying, "Don't look so bewildered. Get over it. I'm as real as you are." The creature stood up on two legs like a human being, with exactly the same body structure and shape, with a few minor exceptions, the most poignant being the monstrous size of the creature, its muscular strength and tone. It was gargantuan, lofty, majestic, powerful, covered from head to toe with dark hair that appeared darker than the night, as the contrast between the background and the Bigfoot was strikingly pronounced. This very masculine Bigfoot cowered in the light of my torch. He kept covering his eyes with his hands, but I guess I couldn't help just staring at the creature in total astonishment, with a touch of wondrous awe thrown in for good measure. For a long time fear had not entered the equation for me, which I think was a jolly good thing. But when I saw the creature's eyes, I knew at once that I had nothing to worry about. There are no words in the English language to describe the kindness and integrity of those eyes. I knew that he was friendly, I knew that he was trying to help me. I nodded at him and proceeded down the left path of the road. The creature shook his head at me, indicating for me to go to the right. "But," I said to him, "I need to get to Sunnydale farmhouse." Using my stick, I drew my friend's farmhouse in the sand. The Bigfoot ran up to the drawing, which I lighted up with my torch. I drew Alicia's large symmetrical farmhouse with the 2 imposing oak trees in the back. The Bigfoot nodded at me. He appeared excited. I realized he knew exactly what I was drawing. He nodded his head profusely, indicating for me to follow him. Once again he was pointing to the right. He ran boldly ahead of me, swivelling his pyramid-shaped head around, rather like an owl's from time to time, to study me through his deep-set honey-coloured eyes that glittered with a red eye-shine in certain lights, to check that I was indeed following him. He glided so smoothly and seamlessly across the ground, at a very fast speed, unhindered by the rocks and potholes in the road. He swung his overlong arms backwards and forwards in time with his 5-foot strides. He moved as if he was floating like a sailboat, bobbing on the water. Unfortunately, I found myself breaking into a run, not to mention a hot sweat. Forget the cold. My heated body no longer felt the icy conditions. I couldn't believe it. There I was at Alicia's farm gate, with a loud, vibrant sign which read Sunnybrook Farm on the gatepost. I was thrilled. I nodded at the Bigfoot. He chatted away happily for a moment, pointing towards the farm. Then he turned around. I watched him gliding away, moving as gracefully as a cheetah and easily as fast. He turned around for a moment, glancing back at me one more time, nodding his head, and then he was gone. I managed to find my truck in the parking bay. I climbed in gratefully, started up the engine, and accelerated. Thanks to the Bigfoot's directions, I got a full sense of the geographic location at night, retracing my footsteps, making my way back to the minivan without much trouble at all. Alicia was thrilled to see me, marvelling at how quick I'd been, while I secretly held on to the knowledge that without the Bigfoot, I would have most certainly ended up hopelessly lost. "I'm so relieved you're back," she whispered to me. "Alec, I don't know how to thank you. Thank you so much. The people in the minivan are so wasted, they haven't got a clue what's going on. I'd be very grateful that when they're sober in the morning, if you would be so kind not to let any of them know about the hold-up. I have a reputation to keep up." I wouldn't dream of saying a word. I filled up Alicia's petrol tank for her. She was able to follow me back to the farmhouse, and then the drunk, grumbling people were offloaded, escorted to their various bedrooms. The following morning I woke up bright and early. The light was streaming through the windows, so I got up to pull the curtains to prevent my wife from waking up. It was a glorious day. I glanced out of the window to see the viridescent green fields surrounding Alicia's beguiling farmhouse, almost twinkling under the morning sun. I marvelled at how spectacular it all looked. I could see a couple of black Frisian horses grazing in the field, while the large silvery pond, surrounded by weeping willow trees, was covered with a sheen that reflected the trees. I could see a few deer gathering at the water's edge for a much-needed drink. When I went down the sweeping ornate staircase, I was struck by how quiet everything was this morning. When I entered the kitchen, Alicia was bustling around her range, busying herself frying bacon and eggs. "Oh, Alec," she said, giving me a warm, effusive hug, "you were my saving grace last night. Thank you so much for saving the day." "It's only a pleasure," I said, knowing full well that the real person who should be receiving all the praise was an unlikely hairy man. But I was hardly going to breathe a word of my encounter with anyone, not even my own wife, I might add. Needless to say, the breakfast was served at 2:30 in the afternoon. Everyone was sleeping off their hangovers and slept in very late. I'm glad to tell you that Bobby was reassuring Carter over bacon and eggs that his wife wasn't growing a beard, that she wasn't a bad cook, that he'd made up the story about the sausages in his jacket pocket that weren't as hard as bullets, while Carter was assuring Bobby that his wife wasn't a big fat cow after all. But most people listening to the two men trying to redeem themselves were not as easily fooled, for many a true thing is said in jest, especially under the influence of alcohol. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Carol Huberger was busying herself industriously in her house. She was working up quite the sweat this morning, the likes of such that she had not seen in any of her strenuous gym workouts to date. Not that Carol had ever been one of those women that overexerted herself physically. She infinitely preferred the easier life. Besides, who needed a gym if you cleaned your house with a spirited gusto like she had done for the last hour or so? Who knew housework could be this exhaustingly strenuous? But then again, this was the kind of deep cleaning that does not overlook or conveniently skirt over the dust gathering on top of the doors, or the congealed grease in the kitchen grouting that you meant to scrub clean years ago, but never actually got around to doing it. She had read somewhere that vigorous household cleaning could burn more calories than a gym workout. It had to be true. Carol's legs were throbbing, as if she was exercising muscles she didn't even know she owned. Sweat was trickling down her face like the rain on a glass pane, and her lower back was beginning to ache. In truth, she felt as if she had run the Boston Marathon twice over. In fact, the Boston Marathon was nothing on this, Carol thought to herself. But then again, she had never run the Boston Marathon in her life. But in her humble opinion, it was a hell of a lot easier than tackling the deep cleaning of a circa 1950s double-story home that resembled a large doll's house, that, if she was being perfectly honest, had not been spring-cleaned for many years. She'd love to flop back on the white leather couch like a rag doll, give up, abandon this crazy burst of industrious exertion that her life had not seen in the last decade or so. Her best friend, Katie Wendcock, who lived in the house next door, had told her she was nothing short of crazy. But you could tell Carol that until you were blue in the face, and Carol would never listen to a word you were saying. She could be doggedly bloody-minded when she set her mind to do something. Katie knew from bitter experience that wild horses would not drag her away from her goal. For goodness sake, Carol, why do you give a damn what your future daughter-in-law thinks? Does it really matter? As far as I'm concerned, your house is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it at all. You live in a stunning, beautiful home, and like any other house, it collects dust. It's not a big deal. Nothing wrong with it. You're just being nice, Katie. You know that is not true. You've not seen some of the stains on my ceilings, have you? Now don't get me started. There is so much that needs doing, and I haven't lifted a finger in the house for years. I do the bare minimum, like the dishes, the laundry, and occasionally I run a hoover over the place. I've got to make a good impression. Listen to yourself, Carol. Your future daughter-in-law is going to love you, and if she doesn't, there's something decidedly wrong with her. You hate housework like the rest of us. That's totally normal. You live in a large house, a double-story house. It was built in the 1950s, for goodness sake. The house is older than you are, Carol, and old houses need regular maintenance. You cannot be expected to keep it absolutely perfect. I'm sure your future daughter-in-law isn't going to give you marks out of 10 for how clean you keep your house. Just throw out your clutter. Take it to the dumpster. How hard can that be? Then all you need to do is run a hoover around the place, pop a few flowers in some vases to make it look pretty, and voila, everything's going to be absolutely fine. You're very well-meaning, Katie, I'm most sure, but you just don't get it, do you? Said Carol, grimacing. I've never met this young lady in my life. She's going to be staying with us for the long weekend, and I've got to make the house perfect. What will she think of me if she sees all my clutter? She'll think I'm a lazy slob. She might have second thoughts about marrying my son, if she thinks he could possibly turn out like me. Goodness gracious me, Carol, where is this nonsensical talk coming from? That girl is lucky to have a future mother-in-law like you. Don't forget that for a single moment. So what if your house is a bit of a mess? It's organised chaos, isn't it? You worry too much, Carol. That's your problem.
Life happens, you know. No one is going to judge you for the state of your house, least of all your future daughter-in-law, for goodness sake. For all you know, she's probably worried sick about meeting you for the very first time. She's hoping that you're going to approve of her, not the other way round. Maybe she's worried she won't even be good enough for you. There are mothers out there who believe no one is ever good enough for their boys. You see it all the time. I have a friend called Natalie. She and her mother-in-law are at loggerheads with each other all the time. Her mother thinks she's not good enough for her son. Can you imagine that? They've told each other as much. They hate each other's guts. Both run each other down the whole time. And the son is stuck between a rock and a hard place on whose side to take. My bet is that if you get on with your son's fiancé, that's going to be a promising start. Besides, I don't think she's going to arrive at your house like the health department to undergo an inspection on the inner workings of your freezer or your store cupboards. The idea is absolutely insane. Carol knew that much as she loved her best friend with all her heart, that Katie never could understand how important it was for her to make a good impression on her future daughter-in-law. And yes, if the truth be told, she was hoping she'd like the woman that her son had chosen for a wife. What if she didn't? The thought was a nagging concern. It might make her relationship with her son more tenuous. She didn't want to think about all that. She didn't want to think about the what-ifs right now. That was a pointless expediency that would cost her sleepless nights and moments of anxious contemplation. Right now she had more pressing things at stake, and getting the house into apple pie order, like a bride for her wedding day, was the trajectory of her focus right now. She certainly couldn't afford to engage in any wavering distractions, to steal her attention away from what needed to be done. She had to keep plodding on with the housework like an overloaded mule. The incessant picture of her son's fiancé kept popping into her head like a photograph on the refrigerator of a skinny model that stops you in your tracks from diving into the chocolate chip ice cream when you're ever reminded that those extra treacherous calories might turn you into a blob of ice cream yourself if you're not careful. It was these images of her son's future wife that inspired her motivation to keep going with the job at hand. Carol did not have the luxury of giving up, as in her mind's eye it was a prerequisite for her to have the house gleaming like a brand new pin. Not accomplishing this monumental goal was just not an option for her. Her self-respect would be compromised, and the humiliation of having a house with dog hairs that stuck to the couch for years on end and red wine stains in the carpet that had not been steamed out would be excruciatingly embarrassing for her. There was so much that needed doing, and the list was growing steadily longer and longer, like a mountain she had to climb, or like a long recipe with no end of ingredients that you begin to wonder if it's worth cooking the dish at all, as it's all just so overwhelming and not exactly cheap. Carol ran through the list in her head. The windows needed cleaning, furniture polishing, old magazines, newspapers, and supercilious dust collectors that had cluttered the house for far too long needed to be ruthlessly disposed of once and for all, without any dithering or wavering doubts or any backtracking. The last thing Carol wanted was to be labelled as a hoarder. That was a dirty word that she didn't want to associate with herself. She had watched programmes on television about people's houses overloaded with stuff that was so bad that you could barely walk through the front doorway of the house without being greeted to walls of plastic bags filled with all kinds of knickknacks that nobody would ever use, books, magazines and newspapers, and the list goes on and on. In her humble opinion, a hoarder was likely an elderly person who hung on to things that they never ever needed. She was not like that, she persuaded herself. She had to admit she had let the house's appearance slide in the last few years, like a woman who's given up on taking care of herself, so that her health and fitness had gone into rapid decline, until one day she looks at her sorry reflection in the mirror, wondering who on earth that strange person is, with the sagging jowls, the piggy eyes, and the chin buried beneath folds and folds of flesh, that is staring back at her, until she realizes, in a moment of abject horror, that the hippo in the mirror is actually her, It would seem for far too long Carol had allowed the dust to gather on all the furniture in her home so generously that there were neglected pieces of furniture that you could actually write your name in. The dust was so bad. Then there were the ubiquitous spiders that had moved into her house to comfortably make a home for themselves. Their silken webs were comfortably lining the corner walls in her home. She'd almost feel bad turfing them out, like an angry landlord who had grown indignant towards his tenants and wanted them to leave at once. I will evict them gently on the end of my feather duster and drop them in the yard, she told herself. The more Carol thought of all the things that needed addressing, like a long, drawn-out, very daunting Christmas list, the more overwhelming the chores invariably became. Then there was the stuff that would require a handyman's intervention, stuff she couldn't do herself. There were 2 toilets in her house that needed prompt replacing. You couldn't even flush them anymore. One of the curtain rails in her living room had collapsed. The railing had broken apart. The curtains were lying in a sorry, clustered heap, crumpled on the floor. There were rust marks on the ceiling from water damage, where water had seeped through the roof. All these things needed addressing now, even though she'd put them on the back burner for far too long. If her husband were still around, these things would have been dealt with a long time ago, she thought, feeling a measure of shame over her apathetic insouciance towards the house's ever-increasing physical imperfections. There was only one thought in her mind, only one thought. Everything had to be perfect. In a week's time she would be meeting her son's fiancé for the first time, who would be staying in the house for a long weekend, and she wanted her future daughter-in-law to like her, to hold her in high regard. How could the young woman be expected to respect her when Carol could barely respect herself at the moment, with her house in such a chaotic disarray? How had she let everything slip like this? As far as Carol was concerned, her house was an absolute embarrassment. Katy could try to convince her otherwise, but Carol was not going to allow her well-meaning friend's kind words to cover over the cracks that were so clearly there. Carol emphatically believed that your environment reflected your state of mind. So if that was indeed true, her mind must be a chaotic tangle of mishmashed emotions that she had never dealt with. If she'd seen a grief counsellor, she couldn't help but think that maybe she'd have managed her life a whole lot better. But at the time she couldn't bring herself to go to counselling, as the grief that had consumed her had made her push all help away. When her husband had died 5 years ago, Carol had never been able to get rid of all his personal stuff, and she was loath to admit it was still taking up space in the closets in their room. There was a large part of Carol that believed that getting rid of her husband's stuff was rather like admitting he was never ever coming back, which of course was true. He wasn't. She felt that in some way, on a subconscious level, that if she parted with his things, then he was truly gone from her life for good. And that was such a dreadful thought, as irrational as it was. She wanted to believe that even though he was gone, he was still around, and there were times she was sure she could sense his presence. Sometimes she would stand in his closet to sniff at a shirt, in the vain hope that she could pick up the faint smell of her husband's scent. But all those lingering nostalgic smells had long since dissipated, and his old shirts smelt of nothing these days. Carol had not even told her best friend Katy that she'd been holding on to her husband's stuff for all these years. Katy would be horrified and not best pleased with her. She had tried to encourage Carol to move on with her life, but Carol had clung to the past like an old overcoat that she refused to part with, as putting on a new overcoat did not even bear thinking about. In truth, she knew it would have been judicious to have bagged up all Christopher's stuff and donated his things to charity a long time ago. But frankly, she never had had the courage to do it. But the driving determination within her right now was beginning to write out a new script to her story. This time there would be no reluctance, clouding her life in an ambiguous uncertainty. She had decided with a dogged conviction to donate her husband's stuff to charity, even if it killed her to do so. She would make it happen. This house-cleaning exercise was like a cloud with a silver lining. It would mean she'd be forced to do things she had put off doing for a long time. By the time her son arrived with his fiancée at her house next week, it would look like it belonged on the pages of Hello magazine. Carol would make that happen, as one thing about Carol was she always achieved her goals when she put her mind to something. She reflected over the contrived, rather wooden conversation she had had with her son Lathan on her call with him 2 days ago, that had simply thrown her off her perch. She chuckled to herself now, as Lathan was just like his late father Christopher in so many ways. She actually found it rather endearing. It was uncanny to think that they were like 2 peas in a pod, especially when it came to not being forthcoming with information. They had both been hardwired with a failure to communicate. Carol's husband, Christopher Huberger, won the prize for being reluctant to open up. He had always been so reticently reserved that getting anything out of him had been like extracting blood out of a stone. Many people had privately wondered if Carol's husband communicated at all, for he seemed to shrink into the background rather like the Invisible Man, and was hopelessly ham-fisted in all social situations, so that words he uttered always appeared stiff. Carol had loved everything about her late husband. In her opinion, Christopher's bashfully demure demeanour was part of his charm, and was one of the quintessential reasons she had been so attracted to him. Carol described her husband as like a locked treasure box that you desperately wanted to break into, but you couldn't prise it open, no matter how hard you tried, unless of course you persisted in reaching your goal, as she had done with a huge measure of patience. When you finally got to the treasure, your determination had paid off in leaps and bounds, which Carol had found, as in Christopher she had discovered a kindred spirit. He may not have been the greatest talker in the world, but the couple communicated without words, for they both seemed to know the other one's thoughts, and could easily finish each other's sentences. Carol had never been able to read anyone like she'd been able to read her husband, which had always made her believe that they were clearly cut from the same cloth. Others might have wondered what Carol had seen in Christopher, but they didn't know him like she had done. She had been the gregarious one in the relationship, but behind closed doors her husband had possessed a dry sense of humour. His kindness was what Carol had loved about him the most. He had been like a lovable teddy bear. Christopher had towered at an impressive 6 foot tall, so even if he didn't want to be noticed, invariably he always drew attention to himself, as he was rather like a giraffe that hung around a field of horses that you couldn't help but notice. Christopher had one passion, which Carol always believed was her husband's quiet way of expressing himself. He loved riding on the back of his Harley-Davidson. Carol had actively encouraged her husband's intrepid enthusiasm for biking. Indeed, sometimes she'd even gone with him, riding the back roads of North America on the back of his Harley. They had been like a couple of daredevil, hot-headed teenagers, and some of their audacious, thrill-seeking adventures they had thoroughly enjoyed on the dynamic bike. These treasured memories had never deleted themselves from her memory. Christopher had enjoyed the heedless escapism of feeling a high-powered engine beneath his sturdy legs, along with the wind beating across his face, and she had understood why he loved his Harley so much. You felt as free as a bird on the open road, as if the whole world was beneath your feet, and that you could almost accomplish anything you desired. Very often her husband on a weekend might go off for a few hours on his bike, like others might enjoy a game of golf with friends. Christopher would return home, like a new man, with 2 days' worth of stubble on his chin, giving him a rugged appearance. His hair would be messily tousled from underneath his helmet, and his sun-kissed cheeks flushed bright pink from his intrepid adventure. He would have a contented glow about him, and always looked as if he had soaked up the sun like a salamander. He had always been a bit of a maverick, never had any biker friends, but had taken on this pastime like a lone ranger. Carol had no comprehension of knowing how deadly the Harley-Davidson might potentially turn out to be in the wrong set of circumstances. Of course she had heard of motorbike crashes before, but it had never really hit home to her that her husband's Harley-Davidson might become like a loaded pistol in the wrong situation, that would ultimately create the perfect storm, that regretfully one day would invite the police to her front door to give her the most dreadful news that no wife or husband ever wants to hear about their loved one. Yet despite everything, Carol had never regretted the introduction of the Harley-Davidson into their lives, for it had brought out the explorer in the both of them, and she had always believed that living a life avoiding danger was not living at all. Carol shuddered when the tortuous memory flashed back in her mind, so cruelly, rather like an uninvited guest. She could remember the sombre, saturnine faces of the police when they arrived at her front door, and in that moment her heart had sunk, for she was filled with that gut-wrenching feeling of impending dread and disquiet that had clung to her like the ticks on a dog's back. She'd never forget that feeling, for she couldn't put it into words. "Are you Mrs. Huberger?" one of the police officers had asked her circumspectly. Carol had seen the pity in his brown eyes. She knew instinctively that this call was about her husband, so inwardly her mind was screaming, "Please, God, no! Please, no! This can't be happening to me! It just can't! I'm dreaming all this! I'm about to wake up in any moment! None of this is remotely true!" "Yes, that's me," she had said, choking on her words. "Is everything all right, officer? It's not my husband, is it?" she asked. "He went out on the road yesterday morning, on the back of his Harley-Davidson. Please don't tell me anything's happened to him. He's all right, isn't he? He's not hurt? Something bad hasn't happened to him, has it?" The police weren't forthcoming, but the dark shadow of glumness in their eyes told Carol everything she needed to know. Sometimes you can have a sixth sense about these things. Carol knew instinctively what the police were going to tell her, with the same measure of certainty, of knowing that the sky is blue, the grass is green, and this inauspicious day was going to turn out to be a nightmare, and her life would never ever be the same again. "Mrs. Huberger, we cannot possibly talk about this on your doorstep. Do you mind dreadfully if we come in?" the police officer had asked her gently. She reluctantly nodded, guiding the two police officers into her living room. The officer who took charge of the conversation had dropped his head into an apologetic stance, as if he didn't want to maintain eye contact with Carol, as if the situation was increasingly uncomfortable for him. "Mrs. Huberger, your husband, I regret to say, was involved in a very unfortunate fatal collision. He didn't stand a chance, I'm afraid, according to witnesses. I regret to say he was mown down by a large lorry on the highway when he was overtaking the vehicle. The lorry failed to see him, I'm afraid. If it's any consolation, he wouldn't have suffered at all. His death was instantaneous. It was a tragic accident. We are very sorry for your loss." "No, no," Carol had screamed. "You've got the wrong person, you have, officer. My husband isn't dead. You must be mistaken. You have to be. It can't be true." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Huberger. This must be very harrowing for you. I can't imagine what you're going through. We can put you in touch with a grief counsellor to help you deal with your tragic loss. But I'm afraid there is no mistake. Your husband is deceased." The police officer handed Carol a watch. "This was found on his person. Did it belong to your husband?" Carol studied the watch. She recognized it at once. She had given her husband this watch for Christmas 20 years ago. Her throat became thick and clammy. No words came out of her mouth. There was no mistake. Her husband never took his watch off. She nodded at the police officer and whispered, "Yes, it's his. He's dead, isn't he? He's dead." She whispered the words, and the officer could only say, "Yes, ma'am. We're very sorry for your loss. Very sorry indeed. If there is anything we can do, you only need to call us." "Go away," Carol screamed at the disquieting thoughts that intruded into her mind, like a tenacious, determined blowfly trying to crawl into a horse's eyes that you needed to brush away before it blinds you. Likewise, she tried to squat those nagging memories away, but over the years they had a tenacious, determined habit of burrowing back into her mind at the most inopportune moments, like termites eating their way through the wood of your brain. The last thing she wanted to do was to draw attention to herself or collapse in a public place with an audience of curious spectators looking at her pitifully. That kind of scenario would be Carol's worst nightmare. She hated drawing attention to herself of any kind. She could innocently be taking Herbert, her little white Maltese poodle, for a casual stroll down the street, and the memory of that inauspicious, tormenting day, when she so tragically lost her husband, would impertinently flash into her mind like a blaringly blinding light that you could not ignore, even if you tried. When that happened, Carol's heart would thunder violently in her chest, so loudly she thought it might actually burst through her skin and splatter all over the pavement, in a bloody congealed mess. It would seem in that moment all the breath would be sucked out of her lungs, and she could feel herself beginning to panic. The symptoms were always exactly the same. Her face would become clammy and hot. She would begin to profusely sweat and start seeing double, so that everything would become ambiguously blurry. When this occurred, she knew she was having a panic attack. The doctor had informed her that these unfortunate episodes that had trespassed in her life after her husband's death were not heart attacks at all, even though in that intrinsic moment she might falsely assume that that was the case, and that she was about to die, which wasn't true. It was apparently the body's flight and fight response. It was obviously getting its wires crossed when it perceived there was an impending threat, when there actually wasn't one. Carol's doctor had given her anti-anxiety medication, but they had done little to subdue or discourage the panic attacks. So Carol had gone to a skilled breathing specialist and learnt to breathe in those times of unbridled anxiety. The subtle methods of self-help had succeeded successfully in calming her down. She had learnt about soothing self-talk and trying to tease your attention away from what had instigated the panic attack in the very first place. And this mindful approach had helped her significantly to conquer her inner demons. Regretfully, the panic attacks happened without any advance warning. Carol could innocently be selecting tomatoes at the greengrocer's, and suddenly the unfortunate memories of Christopher's death would come crashing through her mind like a tsunami. And they were doing it again this morning, as she embarked on her house-cleaning adventure, if you could call it that. "Calm down," she told herself. "Breathe in, breathe out. Get a grip, Carol. Think of something else, for goodness sake." She steered her thoughts away from the dark, murky, muddied waters of her mind to something lighter and more congenial. Immediately she found her thoughts anchored on the phone call she had received from her son a couple of days earlier, which replayed itself in her mind like an old record, as if it had happened only seconds ago. It seemed to do the trick. "Mum, I've got something I need to tell you." Carol could tell by the cadence of her son's voice that he seemed reluctant to broach whatever it is he wanted to share with her. She was momentarily intrigued by her son's cautious reluctance, for it meant he had something important to share with her. But true to form, he always struggled to communicate. "You have?" said Carol, wondering what her son had to convey. "Go on, love. What is it? You know you can tell me anything. I'm your mother. That's what I'm here for. It's not something bad, is it?" "No, of course not. It's good as it happens." Carol sighed with relief at that revelation. At least whatever he had to tell her, it wasn't bad. But she knew she'd have to extract the news out of him with a surgical precision. "How's work going?" she would usually ask him. "It's fine," he would say. "Are you eating properly, love?" "But of course." "What is it like in Houston?" "It's all right." "Have you met any nice people yet?" "Maybe a few. But I'm like Dad. I don't make that many friends." These were the kind of stilted, somewhat uncomfortable conversations that Carol would have with her son, who was a chip off the old block, so she knew from experience how to handle the awkward, long-winded silences that others might feel the need to fill with idle chatter to avoid feeling uncomfortable. "You've got something to tell me, love," she repeated gingerly. "You say it's good, so what's holding you up?" She was wishing in that moment her son would spill as generously as a slot machine when it hits the jackpot. Sometimes it could be excruciatingly laborious getting anything out of her son at all. And this was because her son could not help himself but be secretive all the time. "Yes, that's right. I have got some news as it happens." "Well, go on. What is it, love? Don't keep me in suspense. I'm dying to know, especially if it's good as you say." Her son mumbled something incoherent on the line. She heard a female voice whispering in the background. "Go on, tell her. Or shall I?" There was a giggle. She could hear her son say in a low voice to the woman he was talking to, "I told you, I'm going to tell her. Give me a moment, will you? Don't push me. I'll do it in my own time." Is someone there with you, son? Asked Carol curiously. I thought I heard a female voice.
That's right, you did. That's Debbie. Debbie's here with me.
Debbie who? Debbie? I haven't heard of a Debbie. You've never mentioned her before, son. Is she a friend of yours?
You could say that. Actually, she's more than a friend.
Oh, lovely. You've got a girlfriend, son. Well, I'm so delighted for you. This is lovely news. Why didn't you tell me?
She's more than a girlfriend, Mum. She's my fiancée, Mum. We've just got engaged.
You've just what? Asked Carol, almost dropping the cell phone out of her hand, which was slipping through her fingers like butter. Her son's news had come as a shock to her. A bolt out of the blue, if you like. He had never once mentioned any girlfriends to her in the past. And now here he was, spouting this fortuitous news, like the water from a whale's blowhole. It was so shocking to Carol, she didn't know how to react to this. Most parents would be naturally thrilled to hear such great news about their children, but they would be lightly prepared for the probability of their child getting engaged. But Carol was not remotely prepared. She didn't even know Debbie existed until now. Carol didn't know what to feel. She had not prepared herself for such news. It might have helped if she'd actually known her son was dating someone, but he lived such a private life. She knew little about what was going on with him at all. "This is such a surprise, son," she had said obsequiously. "I don't know what to say. I had absolutely no idea you were even dating anyone. Why didn't you say so, son? Honestly, love, you are incorrigible. Believe it or not, I am your mother, and I do like to know what's going on in your life. I so wish you wouldn't shut me out the way you do. It makes me sometimes feel like a stranger. Your father was exactly the same. And I'm sorry to say, love, but it's very frustrating."
Sorry, Mum. I didn't know how else to tell you.
"Why ever not, love? I'm your mother. That's what I'm here for, to talk to. And I love to hear about your life. You know, I would have been delighted to learn about Debbie. I apologize, love, if I sound very shocked, but I just wasn't prepared for any of this. But I assure you I am delighted for you, son. This is fabulous news, and cause for a celebration. I just wish I'd known you'd been dating, that's all. So what's Debbie's full name, then?"
Debbie Whitechapel.
"That's a lovely name, son. How old is she?"
She's 2 months older than I am.
"Where is she from, son?"
She's not from Houston. She lives here, though.
"Yes, but where is she from?"
She's from New Jersey.
"Where did you meet her, son?"
She rented the apartment next to mine. She came back one night from a party. She left her purse in the taxi with her cell phone and keys. She was rather tipsy. She'd been ploughed with champagne from an office party, you see. She knocked on my door. Couldn't remember the name of the taxi cab she'd called. Well, it was an Uber. She was drunk, you see. I let her sleep in my room and I slept on the couch. In the morning she called the Uber and got her purse back. After that we became good friends as we were next-door neighbours. The rest is history.
"Oh, son, I am so delighted for you. I don't know what to say. When am I going to meet her?"
She wants to meet you too, Mum. As soon as possible, actually.
"Well, I'm glad to hear that, love. That's a really good idea. We should get that all into action. Moving, shall I say.
We were thinking we could stay the long weekend with you, if that's all right. Which means we can come down next weekend to Kentucky. Sleep in the spare room together, if you can prepare it for us. We are getting married, so I hope we can share a room with each other, and that won't upset you at all."
"Of course that's not going to upset me, love. You're old enough to do what you like. You know you're welcome to come home at any time you like, and I will prepare a double bed in the spare room for the both of you. How is that?"
"Thanks, Mum. I really appreciate that. We will be coming Saturday morning, leaving on Tuesday morning, if that's all right with you."
"Sounds lovely, love. I look forward to meeting her. Is there any food she can't eat? She's not allergic to any peanuts, perhaps? Something like that. I don't want to get the food wrong."
"No, she's not allergic to anything as far as I know. But I will tell you this, she hates seafood, And her favourite food is lamb shanks. I do know you make a very good lamb shank.
Well, that's very good to know, love. So there'll be no fish on the menu, I can assure you of that.
I appreciate that, Mum. So I'll see you soon, then.
Must I pick you up, son, from the airport or something?
No, Mum, don't worry about any of that. When we arrive in Kentucky, we'll hire a car for 3 days or so. Don't worry about the travel arrangements. We'll see you very soon.
Carol stood there, holding the cell phone in her hands, looking completely bewildered, her mind a blank. For a brief moment it felt as if she'd been hit across the head with a brick. This news took a measure of adjustment, but the first thing she needed to do was to call Katie, her best friend, as Katie had a way of smoothing down the rough edges for her when she was a little overwrought and emotional.
Yeah, said Katie, answering the phone.
What's up, Carol? Everything all right? Yes, I've just got a call from Lathan. You're not going to believe it. What's happened? Carol, is everything all right in Houston with your son? Everything's absolutely fine. Don't worry about that, Katie. Actually, I've got news. He's getting married, Katie. Can you believe that? I didn't even know Lathan was dating anyone. I'm actually shaking, Katie. I'm in shock. I don't even know how to react to any of this news. I know I should be pleased for him, but I feel completely numb. What on earth is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you, Carol. Nothing at all. It's perfectly natural. Your reaction is normal. Lathan's news has knocked you for 6. You've had a shock, that's all, because he's so secretive. But you'll soon come around to the news. He's getting married. Oh, my God, Carol, that son of yours is a dark horse, isn't he? I've always said it's the quiet ones you have to watch. I'm so pleased for you, Carol. It couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow. I don't know what to say. This is a turn-up for the books, isn't it? Like you, I didn't even know Lathan had a girlfriend. Neither did I. But you know what he's like. I can never get a word out of him. So when he springs a surprise on me like this, how am I supposed to react, Katie? I'm sure I didn't sound terribly enthusiastic down the phone, but it was hard to be thrilled for him in the circumstances. I mean, I know nothing about this Debbie girl, do I? I know it's not easy, Carol, but it's great news, I'm sure. You want your son to be happy, don't you? So it's fabulous that he's actually met someone. And you know Lathan. He wouldn't be tying the knot with someone unless he was really in love with them. I'm sure his fiancée's terribly nice if I know Lathan. So go on. What's her name? What's she like? I'm dying to know. Fill me in with all the details. Her name's Debbie. Debbie Whitechapel, I believe. Yes, that's right. I knew a Debbie once. She was terribly nice. Do you know they say people are just like their names, Carol? I believe that. Me personally, I've always liked Caroline's, Jenny's, and Carol's, of course. That goes without saying. Whitechapel. That's an interesting name, isn't it? Wasn't Whitechapel that place in London where all the murders with that Jack the Ripper fellow took place of over a century ago? They never did find out who committed the murders, but I heard somewhere that scientists have used DNA research. They believe Jack the Ripper was a Polish barber who was living in London at the time. They found his DNA on a shawl. I believe they traced it back to his living descendants, and they got a match. Can you believe that? Trust you to think of that. I think you're right. The Jack the Ripper murders happened in the Whitechapel part of London. And it appears that Debbie's surname is Whitechapel. How funny! Well, surnames are also interesting, you know, Carol. For all you know, Debbie's ancestry might actually go back to the Whitechapel area in London. I wouldn't be at all surprised if she can trace her ancestry right back to London. The joke is, Carol, we call ourselves Americans, don't we? But most of us originate from all parts of the globe. That's if you study your genealogy more closely. I did mine once. And you know, Carol, my DNA was traced right back to Northern Europe. And my husband's DNA goes right back to the French Huguenots. So tell me, what's this Debbie like? I'm trying to think whether Lathan would have a type. You know some men, they like redheads, others brunettes, and others blondes. I think everybody has a type, don't they? I haven't got a clue about that. Your guess is as good as mine. Growing up, Lathan never had girlfriends, although I think he rather liked Lucy Crawford. Do you remember her? She lived on the street until her parents relocated to Florida. I think Lucy's father was a civil engineer, if I'm not mistaken. You remember her? Lathan always used to give her a second glance. I couldn't help but notice that. I always suspected he'd have loved to have asked her out, but you know what he was like, painfully shy. But I used to tease him about her, and he'd grow as red as a field of poppies, so I knew he really liked her. That's right, I remember. Lucy Crawford. A pretty little thing she was, wasn't she? Now, she was a brunette. So maybe this Debbie has also got brown hair. So when are you going to meet her, Carol? Next weekend. They're staying here in my spare room for 3 days. I've got to organise it all for them. Oh, my word, Carol, that's amazing. Your future daughter-in-law, Carol. How does that make you feel? I'm excited for you. Before you know it, you'll be a grandmother. Don't say that, Katie. Now you're beginning to make me feel really old. It feels like only the other day Christopher was in diapers, and now he's getting married. Everybody says that, Carol. Our kids grow up so fast, and then they leave home. That's where I say our pets are a sure investment. They never leave, do they? More to the point, how are you feeling, girl? If you don't mind my saying, you sound pretty flat for someone who's learnt their son is about to get married. Well, if you must know, I feel very intimidated. I've got to get the house looking perfect before that girl gets here, and I don't have much time to prepare myself. Hold it there, Carol. Don't you dare go overboard. You don't have to make everything perfect. That's ridiculous. But I do, Katie. I really do. Appearances are terribly important to me, and I do want Debbie Whitechapel to feel welcome in my home. I'm sure she will love you, Carol. Don't you dare go breaking out into a huge sweat over all of this, busting your gut to get everything absolutely perfect. I know what you're like, Carol. Nobody expects you to be perfect. You're the one that has these exacting standards, nobody else. You pile on far too much pressure on yourself, and for what? It's madness. But I can't help myself, Katie. That's who I am. I know, Carol, but if you exhaust yourself too much, by the time your son arrives with his lovely fiancée, you'll be so fatigued you might be too tired to enjoy their stay with you, and that would be a dreadful pity if you ask me. Carol knew Katie had made a justifiable, rather valid point, but her considerate best friend's words were rather like flour going through a sieve, for she paid no heed to them. Carol was resolutely determined that no one was going to disrupt her plans. She intended to get assiduously busy with the housework. When she was entertaining guests, things had to be so-so, and no one was more important in her eyes than her son's future wife. The chores needed doing. There was no time like the present. She would proceed by doing the outside windows first. They hadn't been polished in many years, she was loath to admit. The upstairs windows were a laborious challenge that would almost certainly require the diligent, unflagging services of a professional window cleaner. There was no way on God's earth she was going to courageously attempt to get up that wobbly, precarious ladder, risking life and limb to clean those windows, which she was sure were filthy dirty. With her crippling fear of heights, that just was not going to happen. Some of the chores would require scrupulous delegation as far as she was concerned. Before long she was sedulously polishing the windows at the front of the house, until they sparkled and gleamed like crystal that had been washed in a dishwasher. She was surprised how much she was actually enjoying the job. It was almost meditational, as it helped her mind to begin to relax. That was when she observed Clayton Harrington standing at the front doorstep of his house that was directly opposite her own home. Clayton Harrington was in his 80s, but the look he was giving Carol this morning was so vague, as if he was looking right through her, like a clear pane of glass, almost as if he hadn't even seen her at all. Clayton Harrington was a quiet, unassuming man, who lived a hermetic kind of existence. He never really got involved with the locals in the community, but kept himself to himself. The locals respected his privacy, because if you rubbed him up the wrong way by disturbing his peace, he could potentially become disagreeably fractious and rather crabby. They knew that from bitter experience. But he was one of those enigmatic people that literally seesawed from being jovial to becoming slightly irritable at times. But if he was out and about on this morning, Carol suspected he was probably in a good mood. She understood the elderly man more than most. Her husband had been an introvert, and certainly if he had never married, She suspected Christopher might have been rather crotchety, not dissimilar to Clayton, especially if he'd lived alone like Mr. Harrington did. So she liked to look out for the man. She waved at Mr. Harrington, but he just stood there gawking at her gormlessly, with an impassive, somewhat expressionless look on his face. Was he all right, Carol wondered? She would probably be wise to check up on the man. There was something about the deadpan way he was staring at her that seemed profoundly off. It unsettled her. She hurriedly crossed the road to the other side, walking over to Clayton, who was still staring into space rather blankly. She greeted the elderly man with a warm, friendly smile. "How are you doing, Clayton, this morning? It's so good to see you. Such a lovely day, isn't it? Perfect weather. Absolutely perfect." Clayton's eyes swiveled around in her direction, and he said curtly,
"Who are you? What do you want? What are you doing on my property? I don't welcome intruders here. Why don't you just go away and leave me alone, you silly woman?"
Carol was taken aback by Clayton's brusque, rather clipped tone of voice. He had never behaved like this to her before. He normally had impeccable manners and could be charming, even though he was caustically rude sometimes to the kids in the neighbourhood, if they deliberately set out to annoy him by throwing a ball yards away from his property, or allowing their dogs to run amok over his yard and shrivel his perfect flower beds. "It's me, Clayton. You know, Carol from over the road, Carol Huberger. I live at the house opposite to yours. We've known each other for years. I'm not a stranger to you, Clayton." Clayton fixed his steely eyes on Carol.
"Why are you saying this to me? Talking such nonsense? What are you doing here? I don't even know who you are. I haven't seen you before a day in my life, so don't pretend to know me," he said abrasively. "Now get off my premises, will you, before I call the police?"
Carol's smile slipped from her face, and she very nearly walked away, but she glanced over her shoulders to look at Mr. Harrington again, and the vacuous, lame-brained look had vanished from his face, almost as if it had never been there at all, and then he appeared to be smiling brightly at Carol, as if the awkwardly thorny moment that had transpired between them had never existed at all.
"Hello, Carol! It's good to see you," said Clayton. "What a lovely morning it is this morning. Look at the sky. It's a perfect shade of blue, just like a bluebell, my favourite flower. It's going to be sunny, isn't it? What are you doing up and about on this bright early day like this? By the looks of things, you're a busy bee this morning."
Carol stared at Clayton incredulously, almost as if he was a ghost, as the change in his demeanour that had shifted so quickly was dramatic. Carol's smile bounced back on her face. "Yes, it's a perfectly lovely day, isn't it, Clayton? Really, really lovely. There isn't a cloud in sight. I like it that way. But there's no guarantee, of course, it's not going to remain like this, because the weather forecast was predicting rain. But while it's bright and sunny, I'm going to get as much stuff done as possible. If you must know, I'm attempting at cleaning the windows. I haven't touched them for many years. But once in a while one is driven to address the things one has overlooked for many years, like I am now."
"Cleaning the windows, are you?" chuckled Clayton. "If you forgive me for saying so, Carol, but I've never seen you clean your windows before. As you say, what on earth has brought on this sudden burst of inspiration? I hope it's infectious, like a deadly disease, because if it is, I want to be afflicted with it. My windows could well do with a good cleaning, but unfortunately I'm getting lazier these days. Things take longer to do, you know. When you get older, you know, Carol, physical exertion can be extremely costly on these tired legs of mine, and it takes a lot longer to do anything. Now, when I was in my 20s, it was a whole nother story. You don't realize how good you have it then. I clean people's windows for pocket money, you know, Carol. I was quite nimble back in the day, even if I say so myself. I could get up into all those awkward nooks and crannies. So, What's brought on this sudden burst of inspiration, if you don't mind my asking?"
Carol sighed. "Well, I'm cleaning those wretched windows, Clayton, for very good reason, if you must know. Like you, I would so much rather be putting my feet up. My son is getting married," she said, shaking out the washcloth in her hands. "The windows are absolutely filthy, and I want to make a good impression on my son's fiancée. I've never met her before, you see, Clayton. My son is a dark horse. I didn't even know she existed, but I want the house to shine like a new pin when she arrives here. My mother always used to say, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. They're coming to visit me next weekend, you see."
"Lathan? Getting married? It can't be,"
said Clayton, letting out an amazed whistle and shaking his head.
"Why, only the other day that tiny tot of a boy was kicking around a ball mischievously on the street with all the other kids, and I was telling him off for making too much of a noise, and now you're telling me he's tying the knot? How extraordinary! I hate to say this to you, Carol, but it means one thing for me. I'm getting very old. There is no denying it now. When you see the kids in your neighborhood grow up and have children of their own, you feel as if you've been left behind, if you know what I mean."
Carol nodded her head in agreement. "Oh, I do. Tell me about it. I'm also feeling old. It seems like only the other day I was walking him down this very street in a stroller. They grow up so fast, don't they?"
"Who's the lucky lady?" asked Clayton. "She certainly snagged for herself a good boy. She must be an excellent judge of character. Your Lathan is a nice lad, and good-looking too, if I might say so."
"Her name is Debbie Whitechapel, would you believe? Isn't that an interesting name?"
"Debbie Whitechapel," said Clayton, rolling the name on his tongue. "An interesting name indeed. Now, if you will forgive me, Carol, there are some dishes that need attending, that I've left in the kitchen sink, and while I've got a spurt of energy, I better do them now. Who knows, maybe your industriousness is rubbing off on me. It seems to me, Carol, maybe you are infectious after all. If I hang around you too much, the next thing I know I'll believe I'm 20 again, and be attempting to climb high ladders to reach the more treacherous windows in my home to clean. And we can't have that, can we?"
"You wish," chuckled Carol teasingly. "Like that's ever going to happen in a month of Sundays." She bid Mr. Harrington farewell, crossing the road to the other side, to continue with cleaning the windows. She wiped the beads of perspiration away from her face, and asked herself if the first part of her conversation with Clayton Harrington had actually really happened. "I wonder if he's losing his mind," she thought privately. "I mean, he was so poker-faced and inscrutable. The way he was looking right through me in the beginning when we first spoke was super weird. And then he claimed he didn't know me. I'm wondering if he's developing a touch of Alzheimer's or dementia." Carol had Clayton's nephew's phone number available at hand, should she need to phone him in an emergency situation. But Levi Harrington lived far away in Juneau in Alaska. It didn't seem right to worry him about his uncle's strange behaviour, especially if it had been so fleeting. Maybe she'd got him in a bad moment, when his mind was 100 miles away. He was possibly just daydreaming, and I startled him, she persuaded herself. It was probably absolutely nothing. Levi had always asked Carol to keep a careful watch out on his uncle for him.
"I'm all he's got, Carol. All he's got in the entire world," he had told her. "Everybody else in my family want nothing to do with him. They're estranged from him. It is a pity, but it is what it is. Some of my family, I am afraid, have got awfully long memories. They don't forgive easily. And let's just say he's not on their Christmas card list. I'm the only member of the family that looks out for Clayton. He's getting on in age these days, but remains fiercely independent. But there may come a time he needs help, and when that happens I want to be there for him. So I would appreciate it greatly, Carol, if you would give me a call so that I could make arrangements when that happens. I feel certain the day will one day arrive when my uncle cannot manage on his own."
"But of course," Carol had assured him. "I'll do anything to help." Carol glanced towards Clayton Harrington's house, shaking her head sadly. She decided she would keep a steady eye on him from now on, and if he was showing signs of Alzheimer's disease, she'd have to contact Levi Harrington. But getting in touch with him now might be a foolish, rather futile endeavour. Maybe Clayton had been overtired this morning. I mean, he looked so disorientated and confused. But he had suddenly bounced out of his disengaged state, and that was when he recognised Carol. So he was still compos mentis as far as she was concerned. Maybe there really was nothing to worry about after all. Debbie Whitechapel twisted her fingers rather nervously as she sat next to her fiancé Lathan in the passenger-side front seat of the white Hyundai that they had both hired for their 3-day stay at Lathan's mother's house.
"What is wrong, sweet pea? You look rather troubled," asked Lathan, reaching out affectionately to squeeze his fiancée's hand. "You're nervous, aren't you? Why, I believe you're trembling. That's ridiculous. You shouldn't be in such a state. You're meeting my mother, for goodness sake. You're not going to the dentist for an appointment."
"Damn right I'm nervous, Lathan. I'm terrified. That's a better way to actually put it. I'm so worried your mother won't like me. I've seen so many of those mother-in-law movies on television, where all hell breaks loose when the mother-in-law finally meets her husband's new wife-to-be. And I don't want their stories to be mine. I couldn't bear it if that were to happen."
"My mother's not like that. You're worrying about nothing. You will like her when you meet her. I'm sure she will love the bones of you. That's if she's got any sense, of course."
"You don't know that for sure, Lathan. You're her only son. Mothers can be so protective towards their boys, and only children, well, they're the very worst. Everybody knows that. What if she doesn't like me, Lathan? I'm being deadly serious." Lathan chuckled, as if he thought the very idea of anybody not liking Debbie was hilariously funny. "What are you laughing at, Lathan?" asked Debbie, making a face. "It's not funny. I don't like it when you laugh at me. You make me feel awfully silly."
"You silly? Never. I'm laughing because I've never known you not to get on with anyone. Everybody likes you. You've got the gift of the gab, haven't you? With people, I mean. Sometimes I wish I'd had your social skills. They're enviable. People naturally warm to you. I can't say the same about myself. I'm a lot like my father in that regard. My late father, I mean. He was exactly like me. Very awkward in social situations."
"You're making it sound as if I'm a social butterfly. I'm anything but. I'm just concerned, Lathan. I'm concerned about the way I look today. Do you think I'm appropriately dressed?" asked Debbie, looking down at the white frock with its yellow daisy pattern that she was wearing, with a degree of trepidation on her face. "I knew wearing jeans was an absolute no-no. It was out of the question. You can't possibly wear jeans when you're first meeting your soon-to-be mother-in-law. I had to wear something a little smarter. But I'm wondering if this sundress that I'm wearing is a little bit on the casual side. What do you think, Lathan?"
"You look absolutely beautiful. That's what I think," said Lathan, squeezing his fiancée's hand yet again. "As far as I'm concerned, you could wear a sack over your head, and you would still look perfect. You can't say that for many people, can you?"
"To you, maybe," said Debbie, rolling her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. "But you're very biased when it comes to me. I doubt your mother would approve if I arrived at her house wearing a sack over my head." She giggled. "You never talked about your mother, Lathan. Not much. I mean, what does she actually look like?"
"Well, I think she looks a bit like Shirley MacLaine. But a younger Shirley MacLaine, if you know what I mean. I remember thinking that when I watched a programme with her in it once, that she was a dead ringer for my mother."
"You do? You think your mother looks like Shirley MacLaine? You've got to be kidding me. Is this a joke or something?"
"No, I'm not kidding, nor am I joking. I think she does look a little bit like Shirley MacLaine. The short reddish hair, the fair skin, the blue eyes, that kind of thing. That's my mother for you in a nutshell."
"Oh, no, I can't believe you're telling me this. That means she's terribly posh. Shirley MacLaine, she played a role in a movie as a mother-in-law once. I seem to remember that she rarely looked down on her daughter-in-law, as the lady in question did not come from the same upper-crust background as she did. The poor girl was a fish out of water in that environment. It was too terrible for words.
All right, I will admit that my mother sounds posh. She speaks well. She's well educated, that's all. But she's not remotely condescending in the least, if that's what you're worried about. And everybody does like her.
Debbie pulled a sceptical face. I wish you hadn't told me this, Lathan, that your mother is a dead ringer for Shirley MacLaine. Now I'm more nervous than I was before. I wish to God I hadn't worn this pitiful sundress. What was I thinking? I shouldn't have listened to you. I should have dressed smarter. Something designer, perhaps. That would have been better. I have a Ralph Lauren dress my dad bought me for my sister's wedding. I should have worn that, shouldn't I? Do you know, Lathan, in that movie, Shirley MacLaine was very condescending to her daughter-in-law. Supposing your mother is exactly the same with me? Oh, my God! Why did I agree to come on this long weekend with you? I knew it was a mistake. I just knew it. I'm never going to be good enough for your mother. I come from a simple, very humble background, with 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I can't think your mother will be remotely impressed by that.
You have to meet my mother at some point, Debbie. You're about to become my wife. It would be incredibly odd if I didn't introduce you to my mother before we got married. I've met your parents. Now it's your turn to meet my mother. And I promise you this, you are going to like her. She's probably more nervous about meeting you than you are about meeting her, if I know my mother.
Debbie raised a hand in resignation. All right. You make a valid point there. But I still doubt that she's nervous about meeting me. What kind of clothes does your mother wear?
Is this the 3rd degree or something? Asked Lathan, rolling his eyes in amusement. Honestly, Debbie, you will be meeting my mother in any minute. You'll see how she dresses for yourself. You'll be only working yourself into a lather if you keep thinking like this.
I need to know, Lathan. I'm being deadly serious. How does your mother dress? It's important for me to know these details. I'm the one that has to meet her for the first time, I'd like to remind you. I need to prepare myself for every eventuality. You don't know what it's like to be a woman, Lathan. We don't think like men do. If we did, our lives would be so much easier. Women compete against each other. Nobody admits it, but it's true. If I thought like a man, I'd probably feel quite happy to rock up at your mother's place in coveralls. But women aren't like men. They can be incredibly judgmental, even if they don't mean to be. Lathan thought about his fiancée's question for a moment.
Well, I've never thought about how my mother dresses. But let's just say she always looks well presented, I suppose. She has expensive taste in clothes, you know. Quality over quantity, I suppose. She does always wear her Tiffany pearls. Smart pants, I suppose, flowing shirts. You know, that kind of thing.
Debbie groaned. That's all I needed to hear, Lathan. What will your mother think of this old slip of a dress I'm wearing? She said, staring down at her dress grimly. Imagine if she thinks I got it from a charity shop or something. It was clear that Debbie wished she was wearing something infinitely smarter. Why didn't you tell me all this before, Lathan? You know this kind of stuff is terribly important to me.
You didn't ask me, sweet pea. I'm not a mind reader, you know. As it is, I talk to you more than I've ever talked to anyone else in my entire life. Usually my vocabulary consists of no more than 2 words, but not with you. Believe me, around other people I'm like a closed book with an ambiguous cover. Nobody knows what I'm really like apart from you. When I was at school I received the shy man's label, and it's marked me for life, like an indelible tattoo. I'm exactly like my father. He was the same, and yet my mother got him to talk behind closed doors. So you have much in common with my mother, more than you realize. An innate ability to open up the oyster shell that won't budge, to get to that pearl.
Well, I hope you're right, Lathan. I really, really want her to like me. I'll be gutted if she doesn't like me. I mean, when you marry someone, you marry their entire family, do you not? I mean, if we have kids one day, it's incredibly important for me that they like their grandmother. What about your mother's house? What is that like? Oh, don't tell me it's posh. Please don't tell me it's pretentious. I'll die if it's pretentious. And furthermore, I hate pretentious houses with a passion, like the ones celebrities live in. They're so over the top. The houses you walk in on tiptoes, that you're terrified of soiling the carpets with your shoes. That kind of place. It's not like that, is it?
Well, you'll be glad to know my mother's house is not remotely pretentious, chuckled Lathan. If you must know, it's a 1950s house. My mother is not the neatest person in the world. She's a bit of a hoarder, you see. Although if she heard me say this to you, it would do her nut. The place might be a bit of a mess. My mother likes to do the bare minimum of housework.
Oh, thank God for that, said Debbie, throwing a hand through her shoulder-length brown bob. I'm so glad you've said that. Your mother may be human after all. There is hope for me. I don't think Shirley MacLaine would live in anything less than a very opulent, luxurious mansion that sparkles within an inch of its life, if you know what I mean. I'm sure that woman is swaddled in the lap of luxury. Debbie began to breathe a lot easier. She glanced rather nervously out of the passenger side window to admire the prepossessing views from the window. It's beautiful around here. So beautiful.
Well, that's Kentucky for you. Very green, verdant landscape, rolling hills, trees, that sort of thing. My mother lives in a neighbourhood surrounded by many trees. There's a lovely footpath running through the side of old Clayton Harrington's house, which is directly opposite my mother's house. There are quite a lot of horse-riding trails through there. So if you fancy horse-riding, we can always hire a couple of horses for a few hours if you like. It might be a fun thing to do. I used to play in those woods extensively as a little boy. Had the time of my life there, I did. You're going to love it, that's for sure.
So I can go running down the trail you're talking about for my morning jog, can I?
Absolutely you can. No doubt about that. You'll like it in those woods. Lots of indigenous wild animals, rabbits bobbing around, birds up in the trees, you know the sort of thing. You'll definitely feel you're in the countryside. And there's a lovely creek in the woods, along with an alpine field full of wild flowers and sculptural rocks. It's terribly pretty.
It sounds perfectly lovely. I just wish I could be excited about it all. I'm just feeling so damned anxious about meeting your mum.
There's no need to be anxious about meeting her. I assure you everything's going to be just fine. Besides, we're almost there, said Lathan, glancing at his fiancée's grimacing face. In a trice the white Hyundai was rolling down a street, where all the houses looked to be circa 1950s, but most had been renovated in recent years. It was a mix between ranch-style homes and double stories, all with neatly mowed front lawns and manicured hedges, along with pretty assortments of flowers tumbling daintily out of terracotta flower pots in a celebration of summer. It was a warm day. The sky was the colour of a forget-me-not, and the cheerful sun cast its golden light over the houses, so they were washed in a pretty luminescence that only the morning can bring. Well, here we are. This is it, said Lathan gingerly, pulling up to a red brick driveway to park in front of a pretty, perfectly shaped double-storey house that rather reminded Debbie of the doll's house she had once possessed as a child.
This is it! This is your mother's house, she gasped. It's beautiful, Lathan, really beautiful, so inviting, so welcoming. It's certainly got curb appeal.
It is rather lovely, isn't it? It's rather strange being back, if you must know, after all this time. Quite nostalgic, really.
The house was happily nestled in a pretty front yard, overlooking the street with a gleaming blue front door, polished windows that were so clean they sparkled in the morning light. The house looked as if it was freshly painted, and the front yard was absolutely perfect, full of flower beds bursting with pretty blooms. The place oozed incredible charm. Debbie could see some curtains twitch in a downstairs room, as an ambiguous face peered out of the window, and then quite suddenly the front door flew open. A woman came eagerly dashing out of the house, with a warm, sunny smile planted on her face. Lathan was not wrong. His mother was a young version of Shirley MacLaine, and Debbie felt instantly intimidated by the appearance of the woman. She sat in the car, frozen for a moment, her skinny legs buckling beneath her, her heart pounding vigorously in her chest, as she anticipated the reception she might receive from this very impressive-looking woman, who she was praying would not snobbishly look down on her. Carol Huberger did not appear to have a single hair out of place, judging by the white trousers she was wearing with the gold belt and glitzy gold sandals, along with the ethereal silk floral top that floated around her like the sails on a boat in the wind. It made her look incredibly fashionable. Those clothes certainly did not come cheap. Carol looked stylish and elegant, and Debbie suddenly felt conspicuously dowdy and uncomfortable in her sundress. She really should have been more judicious about what she chose to wear today. First impressions were extremely important. When they climbed out of the car, Carol Huberger had thrown her arms over her son so tightly that for a moment Lathan did not think she'd let go of her hold over him. But finally she did. Carol chuckled as she looked lovingly into Lathan's eyes. "Oh, you look so handsome, son. It is so good to see you. I've missed you so dreadfully. It's been such a long time since you were last here. Look at you. You look just like your father these days. The likeness is so uncanny." Carol could not help but run inquiring eyes over Debbie Whitechapel, and she felt only relief when she studied Lathan's fiancé, trying to hide her obvious curiosity. Debbie Whitechapel appeared rather nervous, but Carol thought she looked likeable, and Carol could deal with likeable. She would have liked to have thrown her arms around the young lady to welcome her into the family, but that would be too presumptuous. It was better just to offer her a handshake, which she did, along with a warm, welcoming smile. "Lovely to meet you, Debbie. I must congratulate you on your engagement to my son. You've obviously got remarkably good taste in men. It's a delight to finally meet you. I'm very happy for the both of you. Now please do come in." Debbie's account. When I first laid eyes on Carol Huberger, my future mother-in-law that is, my heart sank like a stone being flung into a deep body of water. I felt incredibly intimidated by Carol when I first met her. She looked so incredibly upper crust and well-to-do, far too upmarket and classy to associate with the likes of me. She really was the doppelganger for a younger Shirley MacLaine. Now I was nervous. My future mother-in-law was really posh. I had originated from very humble proletarian roots with two working-class parents who had struggled to send me and my siblings to college. They had worked 4 jobs between the two of them. I was not sure I would meet up to Carol's genteel, exacting expectations. If she thought I lacked polish and was unsophisticated in my ditzy sundress, she certainly didn't register any disapproval in her eyes, which I was extremely grateful for. At least she was polite, and didn't appear to look down on me condescendingly. Instead, she greeted me formally with a handshake, and led us into their lovely upmarket home. Lathan told me that Carol was a tad untidy. My foot! There was nothing remotely out of place in this house. It was so clean and incredibly meticulous you could have eaten your food off the polished walnut floors. There were flowers distributed everywhere very generously throughout the house, and the house smelt exquisite of both lemongrass, neroli, and rose. Our bedroom was sumptuously presented, like a suite in a grand hotel, with indulgent ritzy toiletries, luxurious bed linen, and fluffy towels, and even chocolates on the pillowcases, so that we were made to feel terribly welcome. The dining room, with its wood-panelled walls and complimentary vintage red colour scheme, seemed to have been set to prepare for royalty itself. The long walnut table was covered with a starched linen white tablecloth, and there were extravagant displays of fragrant red and pink roses lining the centre of the table, along with a silver candelabra filled with red candles that were all set alight, so that when I sat down to enjoy the family meal, I felt rather like a fish out of water, but in no time at all Carol made me feel remarkably relaxed. "So tell me, Debbie, all about yourself. I'm intrigued to know all about you. How exactly did you meet my son?" she asked. She handed me a delicious fluffy bowl of mashed potatoes. The food we were eating for lunch was absolutely superb. It was my all-time favourite food, Lamb shanks, melt in the mouth they were, done in a red wine gravy. The meat was so tender and juicy, it just fell off the bone. There was no doubt that Carol was an extremely impressive woman. She was without doubt a killer cook, so I was enjoying the meal, and the expensive, rather heady red wine she served seemed to calm me down significantly, so I was able to abandon my inhibitions. I was silent for a brief moment, as I awkwardly stumbled on my words. Should I tell Carol how we met, I wondered. It was a tad embarrassing. "Well, it's not pretty, I'm afraid," I told her nervously. "I don't know if there's any polite way to say this, but the day I met your son, I was very, very drunk."
"You don't need to go into all of that,"
Lathan told me, but I continued to tell Mrs. Huberger our story. "Well, just so you know, Mrs. Huberger, I'm not a drinker. I don't even particularly like alcohol all that much. But one of the people at work was leaving to go abroad. He was moving to Ireland, you see. We threw a big farewell party for him at the bar in town, and some of my well-meaning work colleagues ploughed me with an excess of alcohol. You know what people can be like. I don't know why I agreed to drink so much. I'd never behaved like that before. I should have had my wits about me. It's embarrassing when I look back on it all. Everything about that party was blurry and ambiguously vague, as if I'm looking through the mist on the bathroom mirror, I'm ashamed to say. I don't remember it very much. I'm usually prudent about how much I drink, but this time I drank more than I've ever drank before. But I guess I learnt a salient lesson. Never again, never. I certainly don't like the feeling of being so drunk."
"Well, I can understand that, my dear. I've been drunk before myself, and I can't stand the feeling of not feeling as if my feet aren't firmly on the ground, if you know what I mean."
"I know exactly what you mean. It was like that for me. I was very lucky because my sober friend Felicity called me an Uber taxi on my behalf, charging it to her own account. She's a very generous girl. She gave the driver my address. I remember her saying to me, 'My God, you're drunk, Debbie. How much have you had to drink tonight? You're completely legless.' 'I'm not drunk,' I told her, slurring my words and giggling a lot. When I got into the taxi, I really was giggling like a teenager, Mrs. Huberger, hooting with laughter at absolutely everything. I seemed to find everything hilariously funny, including that dangly thing on the dashboard mirror, which I think was an air freshener. I don't know why, but I found it so funny. I don't think the Uber driver was remotely impressed by my behaviour. He warned me that if I attempted to get sick in his car, he'd throw me out of his cab in a heartbeat and charge me for all the cleaning costs. I remember he kept watching me vigilantly through the visor mirror. He was very suspicious. I don't think he trusted me not to throw up over his entire car. I did feel a bit nauseous, but I giggled the entire way home. As I said, I found everything crazily funny."
"What's wrong with you people? Why can't you youngsters stop at just a couple of drinks? In my day we knew how to control ourselves. Why do you have to drink a whole damn brewery? What's the fun in that?"
The driver mumbled. Even though I was drunk, I do remember his words. He was not remotely happy to have picked me up. When I got to the apartment block where I live, the driver got out of his Uber in the parking lot, opened the door for me, practically dragging me out of the vehicle, as if he couldn't get rid of me fast enough. I suppose I can't really blame him for that. I was such a sorry, wretched sight, Mrs. Huberger. I'm so embarrassed just even thinking about it. The poor, poor Uber driver. Well, he wore an expression of revulsion on his face. I'm sure I stank of alcohol, and I was staggering all over the place.
Don't be so hard on yourself, dear. We've all had our moments when we haven't been at our best, but it's a forgivable offence. At least you got an Uber home. You didn't drive on your own, and that's highly commendable.
Well, thanks for saying that. It's very kind of you to say that, Mrs. Huberger. But anyway, I swaggered rather awkwardly to the lift. I took it up to the 3rd floor and discovered to my horror when I got to my apartment that I'd actually left my purse containing my mobile phone in the back of the taxi. In truth, I think it had slipped under the seat, if I remember correctly, so the driver himself would not have seen it. He had long since left, so I was locked out of my apartment, and I was so disorientated and so wobbly on my feet that I couldn't think clearly. So the only thing I could do, Mrs. Huberger, was to bang on your son's door. He was my immediate next-door neighbour, you see. Well, I made such a huge fool of myself, but your son, Mrs. Huberger, was so kind to me. I practically passed out on his front doorstep, but he brought me into his flat, gathering me back to my feet. Well, please don't call me Mrs. Huberger, love. My friends call me Carol, and I would like it very much if you did too. And you know, I do expect my son to be kind to people when they've got themselves in a rough place, so I'm very glad he was able to help you in the circumstances. Well, he did more than help me. Your son was so kind, Mrs. Huberger. Of course, I think he was shocked by my drunken state, but he recognised me as being his next-door neighbour. I mean, we'd seen each other in passing in the lobby. He told me I was in no state to do anything about my purse until the morning. He gave me a bed for the night, which was so kind of him. He slept on the couch. In the morning, when I woke up in my next-door neighbour's apartment, which was your son, of course, I couldn't understand what I was doing there, until I remembered my drunken behaviour from the previous night. Oh, I felt so ashamed, Mrs. Huberger. Of course you did. That was only natural. But as I keep saying, don't be so hard on yourself. I've done it before, you know, myself. Woken up on a friend's couch, legless as they come. So we've all been there at some point in time. Well, as I was saying, your son was incredibly kind, sympathetic towards me. He told me as long as I was all right, that was all that matters, but that he thought I should probably not drink again, since I didn't really, take alcohol very well. Lathan went off to the bakery on my account to get croissants for us and coffee for breakfast. He then contacted the taxi for me and paid for them to send the driver out to drop off my purse. I mean, can you believe he did all that for me? Well, I can believe it, dear. My Latham is a very good boy. I decided from that moment on, Mrs. Huberger, that your son was a keeper. I was determined to get to know him better, so I kept inviting myself over to his apartment for a chat and a cup of coffee, because I knew he'd never do that to me. He'd never take the initiative to ask me out. Your son, well, he's the reticent type, isn't he? I knew he would never, ever do the chasing. He was far too shy for that. So I realised the ball was in my court. I'd never been that assertive before, nor have I ever chased a boy. But this time I knew if I wanted Lathan, I'd have to be the one in the driving seat. I knew I'd struck gold meeting your son, Mrs. Huberger. I knew a good thing when I saw it. So I pursued the relationship, rather like a bat out of hell. I mean, Mrs. Huberger, it took forever for your son to get the message that I actually liked him, in a special way. Finally, I was so exasperated, I just said to him, Lathan, I've got strong feelings for you. I'd really like to date you. And you know what he said, Carol? No, what did he say? She asked. He just said, that's fine. Carol chuckled. That is so typical of Lathan. Talk about being vague. I mean, what does fine actually mean? That's exactly what I thought. I wasn't sure what it meant either. I actually said to him, what do you mean by fine, Lathan? And he said, it'll be a pleasure to date you, Debbie. Well, that was that. We fell for each other. Very hard, actually. Your son then asked me to marry him about 2 weeks ago. I could hardly believe it, Mrs. Huberger. I didn't hesitate to say yes. Lathan is the very best thing that has ever happened to me. And it's like it was just meant to be. I know the drunken side of our love story is not particularly romantic, Mrs. Huberger, But it was the way that me and your son met. And then afterwards things between us blossomed. And now here I am, can you believe it, sitting here over your dinner table, eating the most delicious lamb shank that I've ever tasted in my life. It's sobering to think that had I not taken the initiative, or the bull by the horns, well, I might not be here now.
Well done to you, my dear, for going after what you want and pursuing it with a passion. Highly commendable it is. And you're absolutely right about my Lathan. He's, well, you know, rather like his late father, a chip off the old block, so to speak. Rather reluctant to chase after a pretty girl. His father was much the same, you know. So like you, Debbie, I had to tell my Christopher that I was the girl for him. I had to make all the decisions in that regard. I told him I liked him, and that was that. And we sealed the deal. We got together. I think we got married about a month later. That was how quick it was. Mum, would you stop talking about me and my late father, as if we're marble statues without any emotions of any kind? Sweetheart, you've said it yourself. You know very well you've never been forthcoming. Your father was much the same. What I'm trying to say here, had Debbie not pursued you, you might be alone in your apartment in Houston right now, even as I speak. So it is absolutely wonderful the two of you got together like this. Mum, I just wish you wouldn't go down this road. You're making me feel very uncomfortable. Oh, don't listen to my son, Debbie. He's overreacting. Now don't you dare apologize for getting drunk, dear. We've done it before at some time in our lives. If we say otherwise, we're lying through our teeth. We've been there and got the T-shirt. I'm just very glad that Latham here gave you a bed for the night. It was certainly the right thing for him to do. I think I can call him a chivalrous gentleman. That's how I raised him. My husband was much the same, you know. The quintessential gentleman, always opening up car doors for me. Stuff like that. He was a terribly considerate man. When it comes to drink, Debbie, some people just can't handle alcohol. I'm also one of those types. I can't drink much without getting very drunk. It sounds like you overdid it on that night. Now, what I want to know, I want to get the nuts and the bolts of this conversation. What is it, Debbie, that you like most about my son? What do you find very attractive about him? Mum, must you ask Debbie these questions? You're embarrassing me. Debbie, you don't have to answer my mother if you don't want to.
I flushed as red as a field of poppies and let out an awkward giggle. Relax, Lathan. I'm happy to talk to your mother about how we met. Well, what is there not to like about Lathan? He's the whole package, isn't he? I like the fact, Carol, that Lathan is so reserved. I've always been attracted to men who are more self-effacing. Maybe because I'm the reverse. So we kind of complement each other. I'm more creative, artistic, gregarious and outgoing. Lathan is prudent, judicious, mathematical, quiet and unassuming. So it works for the both of us. His strengths are my weaknesses and vice versa. The last thing I'd ever want is to be with someone that was exactly like me. I couldn't think of anything worse.
I know exactly what you mean, my dear. That makes perfect sense to me. Lathan's father was much the same, you know. A very contained man he was. But I always knew what he was thinking, even though he was a man of very few words. So tell me, dear, when are the two of you getting married?
Well, we're thinking of doing something in a year's time, aren't we, Lathan? But we want to make the wedding small. You know, just a few people. We were thinking of a private beach wedding in Hawaii. Something like that.
That sounds perfectly lovely, dear.
It was after a very enjoyable lunch spent with Carol Huberger that me and my fiancé Lathan began to bring out the suitcases that were packed in the back of the hire car. And that was when I noticed him for the very first time. The old man from the house opposite, standing in his front yard, staring right at us blankly, almost as if looking through a glass pane. But his expression was just so vacant, as if he wasn't all in there. Who's that man? I asked Lathan. He keeps staring at me, but it's like he's looking right through me. It's creeping me out, Lathan, it really is. He almost looks like a ghost.
Oh, that's Mr. Clayton Harrington, said Lathan, smiling warmly. He's a very quiet person, keeps himself to himself, although he's known to be a little prickly at times. When I was a kid, we would call him the porcupine, because you handled him with care, if you get my drift. His house is right next to the hiking trail I was telling you all about. If you see that dirt road on the side of the house, and all the trees at the back of the property, they stretch back for many miles into a luxurious, rather sprawling woodland oasis. The locals love to access it. You can do anything. You can take an ATV down there, a horse perhaps, or even a mountain bike. That's the trail you can go on for your morning jog if you like. Mr. Harrington lived in that house for many long years, you know, with his wife. I suppose it's only polite to go and say hello to him, now that he's seen us. He's probably just naturally curious about you. Maybe that's why he's staring so rudely. But don't be offended by the man. He can be a bit in your face, but he's actually very nice, you know. I'll introduce you to him myself.
Lathan took my hand in his, and together we crossed the street. The old man was standing next to a purple buddleia bush in his front yard, where butterflies and bees were pollinating the purple blooms industriously. He was staring into the ether, with a vacant expression on his heavily wrinkled face. He barely acknowledged us as we made our approach. My first thought was there was something wrong with him, for he was like a dead man standing, and his vacuous expression continued to give me the creeps.
"Hello, Mr. Harrington. It's very good to see you,"
said Lathan, stretching out his hand to shake the old man's.
"Long time no see. I've been away for a while, you see, but I hope you haven't forgotten about me," he joked. "I'm sure my mother told you I'm living in Houston these days, so I'm a little far away from home."
The old man turned around and looked straight at Lathan with a haunted look on his face. It was as if he was caught up in a world of his own. I felt almost tempted to wave a hand in front of his face and say, "Hello, is anybody in there?"
"It's me, Lathan Huberger, Carol's son. Don't you remember? Or have I changed so terribly much? I must admit I've been away for a while, but I'd like to introduce you to my fiancée. This is Debbie Whitechapel. We're here visiting my mother, all the way from Houston."
I gave the man a watery, rather insincere smile, hoping in vain he might acknowledge me, but I wasn't holding out much confidence. The man's face was so white, his complexion pallid, his eyes almost looked like hollow sockets, his whole body pretty crooked. He seemed rather slumped over. As I expected, Clayton Harrington did not take Lathan's hand in his, nor did he bother to take mine. The moment was incredibly awkward. All of a sudden Clayton Harrington's eyes grew round, and suddenly the old man grabbed Lathan's arm and said,
"I've seen him. He's very big. You must watch out. Very, very big feet. Big feet. He was watching me, you know. He followed me home. I told you, he's big. I knew what he was when I saw the feet. He's very clever, you know. Far too clever. He can see right through you. You've got to watch out. You must watch out. He knows things. He sees what we can't see."
He shook his head and trotted back into his house, leaving both me and Lathan completely confounded. We gawked at each other in astonishment, and both shook our heads.
"What the hell was that about?"
Lathan asked me. "Maybe he's losing his marbles," I suggested. "It didn't seem he was all there, did he? Has he got a touch of dementia, perhaps? Should he be living in his house on his own like this?" I asked. "I mean, is he capable of looking after himself? He could be a danger to himself, couldn't he? The kind of person who might leave the oil on in the pot on the hob. Forget about it. You know what I mean? Bringing the whole place down in a pile of smoke."
"It is a troubling thought,"
Lathan admitted, his brow furrowing into worried crinkles.
"I'll need to talk about this with my mother. I'm concerned about the man. If this is the way he's carrying on, he's almost certainly going to need special help." I mean, he barely acknowledged me. In fact, he didn't. He failed to recognize me. And as for you, I don't think he noticed you at all. I understand he refuses to leave the property, but at the very least he needs a full-time carer, doesn't he, on the premises with him, making sure he doesn't do something stupid. You're right. He's certainly caught up in his own world. What was all that about big feet? What was he going on about somebody knowing who we are or something? I've never known him to be like this. He definitely is delusional. But he's getting on in age, and age can be very cruel, can it not? When I retired to bed that night, Lathan was grinning at me like a Cheshire cat, a satisfied one. My mother definitely likes you a lot, Debbie. I can see it in her eyes. I think she approves of you. And that makes me very happy, you know.
Oh, I'm so relieved to hear you say that, Lathan. Your mother's so refined, so classy. I was worried I wouldn't measure up for her. I wasn't sure if I should tell her how we met. I thought she might be absolutely appalled, but I was wrong. I mean, she was so kind about the whole thing. She was cool about it, wasn't she?
My mother's never been the judgmental type. She liked our story very much, and I think she likes you a lot. I can tell.
I like your mother too. She's terribly posh, isn't she? But she's not remotely condescending, nor does she have a superior attitude. You told me her house was a mess, Lathan. How could you say that? This place is an absolute palace. She's certainly not a hoarder. I don't see any junk lying around anywhere. Everything shines like a brand new pin. I'd struggle to find any dust anywhere. And I suspect if I ran my fingers on top of her doors, I'd not even find a speck of dust there either. The house is perfectly beautiful.
The house was a mess, said Lathan. It really was, you must believe me. I know because I've lived here most of my life. But my guess is that my mother panicked when she knew you were coming to stay here, and busted a gut to get the place looking perfect for you. I suspect she wanted to make a good impression on you. I know when people came around for dinner when I was a boy, my mother would stuff all the mess in a closet so that the house would look immediately presentable. She always worried about what other people might think. I don't know why she cared so much, but that's my mother for you. Very particular she is.
That makes me feel so much better, Lathan. Your mother is not perfect then, and that means that to me she is more relatable than ever. But I wish she hadn't felt the need to clean up on my account. I don't mind a bit of mess at all, nor do I care about clutter. I'm used to it all growing up in a large, sizable family. I was around organised chaos all the time. As my fiancé climbed into the luxurious brand new linen sheets of the bed, with me by his side, he said,
"Oh, I'm bushed. Exhausted. That flight took a lot out of me, you know. I don't care if the flight wasn't all that long. It's still insufferable sitting up there in an aeroplane. Can you imagine if we'd driven here for all those hours? I couldn't do it myself. Personally, I feel as if I could sleep for a week. How are you feeling?"
Tired, I admitted. Really tired. But I'm heartily relieved to have finally met your mother. At least the anxiety has finally left me.
Good, I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart. I told you it was a storm in a teacup. You had nothing to worry about. And my mother likes you. You do look infinitely more relaxed, but I can see you're very tired.
Before he switched off his bedside lamp, he asked me if I was going to take a jog in the morning. Too right I am. It's the path we saw next to the old man's house, right?
That's right. You'll find the key to the front door hanging on the hook in the hall, so you can let yourself out very discreetly. Try not to make a noise. Unfortunately, my mother happens to be a very light sleeper. The floorboards and the landing always creak. Also, that Maltese poodle of hers, I'm afraid, is quite the yakker. So if he hears you scurrying around, he might make an awful commotion. And when he starts yakking, he doesn't stop. You know what some small dogs can be like.
The following morning, I woke up with quite a start. My surroundings were so unfamiliar to me. I wondered where I was. I felt a tad confused and disorientated. until I remembered I was in Carol Huberger's house. It was dark outside, with a tiny speck of morning light, stretching its way impertinently across the dark sky, like a long ribbon. I observed it sneaking through an open crack in the curtain that allowed a smidgen of this illumination to infuse the spare room, so that even the furniture became less ambiguous, and I could see my way around clearly. I was used to getting up early. My body seemed to be reprogrammed to this early morning rise. I grabbed my cell phone hurriedly from the nightstand to check out the time. It was earlier than I imagined. It was 4:58 in the morning, nearly 5 o'clock. I could hear the rhythmic snores of my fiancé, see the rise and fall of his chest, which affirmed he was still alive. He was such a deep sleeper that even if I made a noise, he'd be unlikely to hear me. I climbed rather cautiously out of my comfortable bed, reluctant to leave its soft coziness. I made my way to the bathroom, brushing my teeth as quickly as I could, and splashing cold water all over my face. I then tied up my shoulder-length brown bobbed hair into a neat ponytail. I put on a pair of purple leggings and a white string t-shirt. It was warm in the bedroom, so I discreetly left the room, treading very carefully on my tiptoes along the landing. Lathan was absolutely right. The floorboards were making an unfortunate, annoying creak under my feet, and every time I moved, as discreetly as I possibly could, I was half expecting to be interrupted by the loud, raucous yakking of Carol's Maltese poodle. I understood that little Herbert slept in her arms every night. Of course, he absolutely adored Carol. Of that there was no doubt. I also knew there was a cat lurking around somewhere, but apparently he absolutely hated strangers, so had made himself scarce. Carol admitted I would be unlikely to ever get to meet him, as the male cat mirrored the male residents that had lived in Carol's house. He was extremely aloof. And as for little Herbert, that little Maltese poodle did not trust anyone other than Carol, and when I arrived at her house he had eyed me with much displeasure, as if I had intruded on his private territory. Finally I found the key on the hook, and plunged it into the lock, pulling back the chain from the front door. Once I'd opened the door, I was greeted to the fresh scented air with a light wind that whipped against my cheeks. The sky was now a very light colour. I crossed to the other side of the road, and that was when I noticed that Clayton Harrington's front door was half open. I thought that the absent-minded man had obviously gone to bed, failing to close his door behind him. He seemed to be rather scatterbrained and forgetful. I wasn't worried about him, given he was so absent-minded. I decided when I returned from my jog in the woods, if his door was still open, I would drop in on the man just to check he was all right. This was a safe neighbourhood, with the locals who looked out for each other, and there was zero crime in these parts, so I was pretty certain the old man was fine, just suffering from the affliction of being rather dithery and rather confused. I proceeded eagerly on my way down the footpath. I didn't feel like running this morning, so a brisk walk would do nicely instead. I always listened to my body, and I suspected I was physically worn out and exhausted from the build-up of nervous tension I had subjected myself to over the meeting with my mother-in-law. I smiled to myself, as it had all been a storm in a teacup, and my worries had really mounted to nothing. I realized that Carol Huberger was someone I could grow to easily love, which was a huge relief to me. She might bear a startling resemblance to Shirley MacLaine that I had watched in that overbearing mother-in-law movie, but she was nothing like that woman in the movie, which was a huge relief. Carol Huberger was a lovely lady, and I was warming to her in leaps and bounds. I ran down the footpath that was laid with fallen leaves and twigs from the previous fall. The woodgrove smelt earthy, and there was a lingering minty smell intermingled with some jasmine notes that filtered in the morning air. The birds burst into song, filling the woods with their orchestral trills and warbles to welcome in the new morning. It was all so inspiring. My first thought was that anyone that was tucked up in bed was missing out a great deal. It was so lovely to be up and about this early in the morning. The plants and shrubs in the woodgrove were covered with morning dew, and silvery spider webs draped themselves across branches, glistening like ethereal dream catchers. The trail was generous, shaded heavily by tall, lofty trees, most of them deciduous, with boughs abundant with rich leafy foliage. There were ferns and low-growing shrubs growing abundantly everywhere. I noticed pawpaw trees, maples, silver bells, oaks, and buckeye trees, and there were wild berries growing in abundance. Many had fallen onto the path. I noticed a couple of shy little rabbits further down the path, scuttling away from me, and that was when I saw him. It was the old man, Clayton Harrington. He was standing there just staring into space, and he appeared to be talking to someone.
"I told you, leave me alone. I don't want to go home. I want to stay here with you. I'm perfectly fine. I told you I'm fine. Don't make me go home. I don't want to go home."
I stared in disbelief at the idiosyncratic scene playing out before my eyes, like the most weird movie you've ever watched in your entire life. Clayton Harrington was more than just a little dithery and confused. The man was absolutely delusional. He appeared to be talking to fresh air. He must be completely mad. As I got closer to the bonkers old man, a figure that I believed had been a short, stout tree with burly proportions that I'd not been paying attention to, suddenly just moved. It was speaking to Clayton in an authoritative tone of voice, but in a language I didn't understand. His words were earnest and slow, and Clayton Harrington appeared to be hanging on to his every word, but he seemed to be rebelliously reactive towards the figure he was talking to, like an insubordinate, petulant child in the classroom that doesn't want to do what he's told. Mr. Clayton's behaviour was juvenile and almost childlike. I sneaked up gingerly behind a tree to watch and observe everything that was going on. As I got closer and closer, I realized that the tall, lofty figure that had been talking to Clayton Harrington was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. The creature by a tree's standards was short, but very tall in comparison to an average human being. I believe he could have been 10 foot tall. He was burly and Herculean in his proportions. He was covered in long flowing dark hair, with a face so astonishingly human, it took me aback. Indeed, I hate to say this, but his face rather reminded me of one of the professors at the university I'd attended, a somewhat intimidating man called Sidney Rothercher. But the facial resemblance was uncanny. I just hope he's not listening to this now, because I doubt he would be amused. The creature had a flat nose and very pronounced cheekbones. This is not what I'd expected to see, and for a brief moment it was so surreal for me, I almost wondered if I was dreaming this. I remember my eyes widened, my mouth dropped wide open, and my heart began to thunder in my chest. The Bigfoot was possibly the most terrifying creature I have ever beheld, the kind of being you wouldn't want to stumble across in the dead of night, for you might think the Grim Reaper had come to collect your soul, to take you straight to hell, with no hope of any redemption. I had heard of Bigfoot before, of course I had. In truth, I'd never paid much attention to the subject. I guess I always just assumed that cryptid creatures were just legendary, rather like fairies and the little people, that belonged with folklore, fables, fairy tales and legends. I remember my mother used to believe in such things. She believed that Bigfoot existed, as she believed in the little people. I'm ashamed to say that the rest of my entire family would scoff and ridicule her, teasing her for being so fanciful. My father would say she was a big dreamer, but my mother would always say, "You laugh at what you don't understand, but I assure you these things do exist." My mother's family emigrated to America during the potato famine. So on my mother's side of the family, we had a strong Irish lineage. On my father's side, they came from England. My mother had tales from her grandmother about the little people. None of us believed her seemingly fictitious stories. But now, as I was staring at this real live Bigfoot, it was like a locked door in my mind that had been bolted for so many years just flew wide open. I realized that perhaps my mother's stories from Ireland about the little people were not so far-fetched after all. Maybe they were true. I had been a doubting Thomas all my life, driven by extreme scepticism, which I suspect my years at university hadn't exactly helped. I guess I never believed in things I physically couldn't see, but my mother was always quick to point out that just because you cannot see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. My mother's grandmother had lived in Ireland all her life, and had told my mother that when she was a little girl, she was playing dollies with her little sister Amelia out of doors. Both the children had been given china dolls as a gift from their grandparents. My mother said the dolls were dressed up in spectacularly beautiful clothes that my grandmother's mother had made especially for them. By all accounts, she was an excellent seamstress, so my grandmother and her sister were extremely proud of their very smart dolls. They decided to leave their dolls sitting under the shade of a large oak tree in the front yard. They hurriedly ran indoors to get their tea. When they returned to the yard to resume their game of dolls again, they found, to their astonishment, their dolls were completely naked, missing all their clothes. My grandmother automatically assumed that a friend of theirs, who had light fingers and was very jealous of their dolls' pretty dresses, had stolen them on a whim. It was the only thing that made sense to them. Their mother made them more beautiful dresses for their dolls, so they were very happy about that. My grandmother and her sister decided that they would never ever leave the dolls in the yard unattended again. They didn't want any more clothes to be stolen. They kept their dolls safely in their bedroom. One morning they woke up from a good night's sleep, only to observe that their precious dolls were not wearing their usual clothes. Instead, they were dressed in sackcloth. No one could understand what on earth was going on, and who had succeeded at entering their bedroom during the night without being observed, just to steal the pretty dresses, as nothing else in the house was missing. One night my grandmother woke up in the middle of the night to hear a strange scurrying sound in her bedroom. She sat up with a start, discovering to her amazement that her beloved doll was lying naked on the floor, stripped of all her clothes. And that was when she saw two little people standing over her doll, trying to dress it up in a horrible dress made of sackcloth. My grandmother saw that one of the little people was wearing one of the doll's dresses that had gone missing that day when they had left their dolls in the yard. She obviously wanted to acquire another pretty dress for herself, and had removed the dress that my grandmother's doll was wearing. My grandmother watched the little people dress her doll in sackcloth. When they realized she had seen them, they looked at her and giggled mischievously. And they hurriedly scurried away. She never ever saw them again. When she told her mother what had happened, her mother told her she had observed the little people, and now the disappearances of the dolls' dresses made perfect sense to her. My grandmother's mother made the little people outfits to wear, both female and male outfits. She would leave them for the little people, so that they had lovely clothes instead of sackcloth. My grandmother's mother said the little people must be very happy, as they would leave her daisy chains, little handmade woven baskets, and tiny bunches of flowers, and that happened for many years. When I was told the story, of course, I didn't believe a word of it. But now, as I stood there staring at this Bigfoot, talking to the old man, I wasn't sure about anything anymore, as my view of reality had been dramatically shifted. The Bigfoot I was observing was definitely all male. I could feel his all-consuming masculine energy, as if the air around me was charged with testosterone. But it wasn't an angry, frustrated energy, more a powerful, commanding, warrior-like energy that demanded respect. What confounded me was he was not remotely aggressive, but seemed to be kind in nature, but firmly spoken towards Clayton Harrington, as if he was not going to take any nonsense from the old man. He had a firm hand on Clayton's back, and was steadily guiding him back through the woodgrove, as if encouraging the old man to go back home. But Clayton Harrington was having none of it. He was behaving like a spoilt, petulant brat that did not want to listen. "But I want to be with you," the old man chortled. "Why can't I come back with you? I don't want to go home. There is no one at my home. I want to be with you." Once again the Bigfoot spoke to the old man, in a strange idiosyncratic language. Mikalina holataka hisapatilana holanikwa hisapala. But the old man seemed to understand what he was saying. The Bigfoot was trying to encourage the old man to walk through the woods and go back home, with a nudge of his hand. But Clayton Harrington resisted. He oscillated his arms around him like an angry octopus. I told you, I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you. All of a sudden, I snapped a twig under my feet. I held my breath, hoping I had not been heard. But it was too late. The Bigfoot's face shot up. His focus turned towards the tree where I was hiding. My heart sank. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I could almost predict it. The Bigfoot had been nice enough to a rather helpless, harmless old man. But how would the same creature react to me? I was about to find out, and I wasn't looking forward to it one bit. I could hear the heavy, ponderous feet pounding the forest floor like a pestle and mortar. And then there he was, standing only 2 feet away from me, watching me cowering behind the tree like a frightened deer that had been discovered by a hungry coyote and was about to become prey. I could hear his sharp intake of breath as his dark, steely eyes pinned themselves on me. There was a somewhat bewildered expression that came upon his face. I didn't think the Bigfoot had realized that I had been there. He had been taken off guard. I cannot describe to you the feeling of standing only inches away from a strapping, broad-shouldered male Bigfoot with such a powerful, shredded body. It would make some of our most hardened bodybuilders look pathetically puny and seem wretchedly frail by contrast. I remember my heart was literally galloping in my chest, almost as if thousands of male stallions were jumping right through me at the speed of light. I was so frightened standing before this Bigfoot, so vulnerable and fragile. I literally wanted the ground to swallow me whole, so that I wouldn't be here. You may ask why I did not run away, but that would have been impossible, as my body had become so rigidly stiff, so unobliging, that I was anchored to the spot, like a ship in its mooring place. It was when the Bigfoot's honey-brown eyes met mine that I was hit with a profound sense of knowing that all was well, and that I was perfectly safe and secure, and nothing bad was going to happen to me. I was flooded in what I can only describe as waves of a warm ocean that washed over me, and my fear just floated away like a balloon on the wind. What happened next was extraordinary, to say the very least, as the Bigfoot spoke to me in his unusual language, and I remember thinking, how was I expected to understand a word of what he was saying? But I need not have worried, for the meaning of his words tumbled into my head, for reasons I could not fathom, but I understood exactly what he was saying. Looking back, I always wondered how that actually happened.
Matikwa, sinatila akinakwa, hodali sakinolo, anikali solobanasa, hikakwana. I need your help, said the Bigfoot, pointing towards the old man. He's very confused, I'm afraid. He's hovering between the astral and the real world. It happens sometimes before people leave this world. His time is short, I'm afraid. He's soon to go. But at this stage he doesn't understand whether he's coming or going. You see, he's floating between two realms. He's disorientated. He appears to want to come with me. I have tried to take him back to his home, but he refuses to go. He's been like this over the last week or so, but he cannot stay here in the forest on his own, not in his state of mind. He's far too confused. He wants to come with me, but where I go he cannot come. Maybe you can talk to him, persuade him to go back home, because I've tried my best to do so, but he's not listening. He's very obstinate, you see.
I nodded. I couldn't believe I was actually talking to a Bigfoot. I told him that I would try my very best to get Clayton Harrington to go home. The Bigfoot nodded at me appreciatively, and I watched him hurriedly gliding through the trees, with Mr. Clayton Harrington trying to stagger after him, like an inebriated drunk. "Where are you going?" he cried. "Come back! Come back! Don't go!" But the Bigfoot was long gone. "Mr. Harrington! Mr. Harrington! Are you all right?" I asked, grabbing the old man by the arm. He shrugged me away. "I think you need to come with me, Mr. Harrington. You're a little confused. You need to get home. I'll take you there." Mr. Harrington, who had not noticed me, turned around to glare at me. "Who are you?" he snapped. "I don't know who you are. Leave me alone. Get away from me. I don't want you anywhere near me. Go away." "Mr. Harrington, I'm afraid you're a little confused. How about I take you back home? You can't possibly stay here in the woodgrove on your own. You might get lost. And your friend, I'm afraid, is long gone. He can't help you now, but I can." The old man retracted his arm furiously. "Go away! Leave me alone! Haven't you heard a word I've said? I told you I don't want you anywhere near me. I don't know you. I don't know you." "Mr. Harrington, yes, that's true. You don't know me. I'm Debbie Whitechapel. You remember Lathan Huberger? Well, he's my fiancé. We're getting married, so I'm not really a stranger, hypothetically. I'm Carol's soon-to-be daughter-in-law. You remember Carol Huberger? She lives over the road from you, the house opposite you." "Lathan?" the old man repeated. "Where is Lathan? I've got a bone to pick with that naughty boy. I told him not to ride his bicycle over my foxgloves in the front yard, but he never would listen. Do you know he broke the window in my shed with that ball of his? How many times have I told those wretched brats not to play with a football in the front yard? They seem to hear nothing. They are hard of hearing on purpose, if you ask me. I asked Lathan to replace the broken glass, but he still hasn't paid me for the damages. He's 10 years old, for goodness sake. He should know better than that. And those kids he's hanging around with, Carol, they're not a good influence on him. You need to do something about this." I realized to my abject astonishment that Mr. Harrington believed I was Carol Huberger, and that Lathan was my 10-year-old son, who had obviously been up to all kinds of mischief. He had gone back in his head to another time period in our history, but I tried to use this paradoxical situation to my advantage. "You're right, Mr. Harrington. Of course you are. Lathan's been a very bad boy. I need to give him a good talking to. How about you let me take you back home, and I'll get Lathan to refund the damages for your window. I'll tell him never to play near your yard again, or ever run over your foxgloves with his bicycle." Mr. Harrington nodded his approval, and followed me out of the grove back to his home. When I got him into his house, with some masterful persuasion on my part, I have to say, I promptly made him a cup of tea and something to eat, and then he fell fast asleep on the sofa in his lounge, and I discreetly closed the front door behind me and made my way back to Carol's house. The first thing I did when I got into the house was to make myself a coffee to steady my nerves, as this had been an outlandish morning, where I had encountered a Bigfoot and an old man who thought he'd gone back 18 years or so. I guess I must have made a considerable amount of noise when I entered Carol's house, failing abysmally at employing any circumspect discretion on my part, and as a consequence of the loud clattering sound I had made as I charged past the worn-out bureau in the entrance hall, which rattled precariously, and a vase of flowers was almost dismantled, so I quickly replaced them on the stand before they toppled over. I quickly made my way into the kitchen to prepare coffee, and then the drama began. I could hear Carol's dog Herbert yakking away. The little dog would not stop once he'd got started. Moments later I heard an urgent shuffle of fabric literally rubbing against the walnut floorboards. It sounded rather like a dressing gown. That was followed by light footsteps, and moments later a rather apprehensive-looking Carol appeared nervously in the kitchen. She was holding a baseball bat in her hands in a defensive position, with little Herbert by her side, glaring at me through his dark, furious eyes. He growled viciously at me, as if he thought I was an intruder. Carol looked as if she'd woken up. Just woken up, that is. Her eyelids were rather heavy, her hair slightly dishevelled, Oh, thank God it's only you, Debbie. You gave me quite the shock. I heard an awful clanging noise, and then, of course, little Herbert here wouldn't stop, so I thought someone had broken into the house. Oh, I'm very sorry, Carol, I said apologetically. I didn't mean to wake you up, nor to scare you like this. Lathan warned me that you were a light sleeper, but I completely forgot to be discreet when I got back from my jaunt in the woods.
Heavens, dear, don't you dare apologize to me. You're a guest in this house, I'd like you to remember. I just thought I would investigate the noise, that's all. But I had no idea you'd be up and about so early in the morning. How very enterprising of you. We're usually all very late sleepers in this household, I'm afraid. So your having been in the Woodgrove already is incredibly energetic of you. I am most impressed. I'm the kind of person that would lazily sleep in all day if given half the chance.
Well, I try to keep fit, Carol, but I could never work out in a gym, if you know what I mean. That would kill me with absolute boredom, running across a treadmill and staring at a blank piece of wall all the time. I just could never do that. So I get up early in the morning. I like the fresh air, but it's quite a morning I've had, Carol. It's like the whole morning has been...
Been like what, dear? You've got me intrigued now. I must admit you look rather haunted, if you don't mind my saying so, as if you've had a bit of a shock of some kind.
That's a mild way to put it, Carol. But yes, I think you could say I've had a bit of a shock. I thought I was going to have a normal walk in the Woodgrove this morning, but it was anything but. To tell you the truth, I'm a bit worried about your neighbour. You know, your neighbour across the way, that old man. Something's not right with him.
You mean Clayton Harrington? I didn't even know you knew him.
Well, that's right, that is his name. No, I don't know him, but I met him yesterday when we were bringing our luggage in that we'd left behind in the car. Your son introduced me to him. He looked a little spaced out, rather confused, and he was saying some weird stuff.
What kind of weird stuff was he saying?
Well, he was talking about, something big, with big feet or something, being followed. I don't really know what he was saying, but none of it made any sense. Well, when I went for a walk this morning, I saw that the door of his house was wide open. I wasn't desperately concerned about him. I know you live in a safe neighbourhood, and the weather's been seasonably warm of late, but I thought I'd look in on him on the way back. I thought that perhaps he was scatterbrained and forgot to close the door behind him. Anyway, when I went for a walk in the grove, I got the shock of my life, Carol, because Mr. Harrington was in the grove, wandering around the place, looking, kind of out of sorts, so to speak.
Let me get this right, my dear. Are you telling me that Clayton Harrington was wandering around the Woodgrove at this time of the morning? Goodness gracious me, I can hardly believe it.
I'm afraid he was. I didn't want to tell Carol about the Bigfoot, lest she thought her future daughter-in-law was as mad as a March hare. So I told her what I'd observed, minus the Bigfoot encounter, of course. I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly. Well, he appeared to be mumbling to himself. He was rather disorientated. I tried to persuade him to go back home. He didn't want to leave the grove. At one point I introduced myself to him. He got his wires crossed, and he thought I was you. He started complaining that Lathan was riding over his flower beds with his bicycle, destroying his precious foxgloves. He also complained that Lathan had thrown a ball at his yard shed, and subsequently broken a window. He seemed to believe that Lathan was only 10 years old again. It was like he had gone back in time. It was seriously bizarre. I've never seen anything like it. I didn't even know old people could do that, when they became delusional.
How extraordinary! I thought something wasn't right with him last week, when I was speaking to him. At first he barked at me, was incredibly rude. It was like he didn't know who on earth I was. And he seemed to bounce back to the Mr. Harrington I knew and loved again. He was behaving as he always did in the past. So I didn't think any more about it. I brushed it under the carpet. He was asking me how I was. It was a very convivial conversation, I told him that Lathan was engaged to a lovely lady called Debbie Whitechapel. I told him all about you,
He seemed most interested. And he was very happy for Lathan to have found such a lovely young lady like yourself. He was saying how only the other day Lathan had been a little boy, getting up to all kinds of mischief. For a moment I even wondered if the former part of our conversation had occurred at all, as if it had all been in my imagination. When we chatted together, he just seemed to be all there. I hope, my dear, given he was in the wood grove on his own this morning, that you did manage to persuade him to go home. The poor man can't be wandering around the grove if he's losing his mind, especially at this time of the morning. The man's absolutely incorrigible. What are we going to do about him? I did help him get home, as it happens, but he put up quite a resistance, I'm afraid. It was rather like dragging a kid away from a fairground and saying no, they couldn't have the candy floss. I mean, he was literally fighting back belligerently. I mean, he was behaving like a naughty kid. I used a bit of artistic license, I'm afraid. I told him he'd better get back to his house so that Lathan could pay him for the damages to his shed window. That seemed to inspire him to leave the grove. Money seems to have a magical allure to get people to do what you want them to do, doesn't it? Even in a confused state, I hasten to say. In saying that, I doubt Mr. Harrington is short of a bob or two. I noticed he had expensive pieces of furniture in his house. When I got him into his house, I made him coffee and some breakfast. He started calling me Ginger, telling me he preferred it when my hair was auburn, and that my brown hair was not a very nice colour. I think he called it nondescript. He kept saying, what did I think I was doing dyeing my perfectly beautiful hair such an ugly colour? Carol shook her head sadly. Don't take any notice of him, dear. Your hair is perfectly lovely. It's a beautiful colour. Ginger was his wife. He was married to her over 30 years ago. But his wife died of a brain hemorrhage. He was never the same, you know, after she died. She had auburn hair. He loved that hair so much. He'd never have approved of his wife dyeing her hair brown. So if he thought you were his wife with brown hair, he wouldn't be best pleased about that. He would get upset, even if she attempted to change her hairstyle. So his behaviour towards you makes perfect sense to me. If he believed you were his beloved wife, Ginger, and it seems that he did. Well, I think he did. It was really embarrassing, Carol. He kept giving me sloppy kisses on my cheek, telling me how much he loved me, but how he hated my new hair. Well, Clayton's a little eccentric, my dear. Very set in his ways, he is. He's lived on his own for a long time, you know, and always been quite cantankerous. He likes to keep himself to himself. It was really good of you, Debbie, to make him breakfast for him, given you don't know the man at all. So tell me, did he settle down after you gave it to him? I do hope so. We can't have him gallivanting around the woodgrove like that. Well, I'm glad to say, Carol, he did. Mr. Harrington thankfully passed out on the sofa in the living room. The poor man was exhausted. Judging by his dishevelled state, I think he might have been wandering around in the grove all night, but I can't be sure about that. He had dirt all over his clothes, and there were leaves in his hair. Goodness gracious me, said Carol, shaking her head sorrowfully again. Poor old Clayton. He really is losing his mind, isn't he? I mean, that incident with the yard shed. It happened eons ago, you know. We did replace the broken window for him. My bet is if you went over there now to pay for the so-called broken yard shed window, he wouldn't know what on earth you were talking about. I suspect his mind is jumping around the place like a frog on steroids, and is confusing the past with the present, and he's jumbled them up together, so he can't see the woods for the trees. Poor man. What are you going to do about this, Carol? I mean, I know it's none of my business, but Mr. Harrington clearly needs some help. He's not all there. He could be a danger to himself. Carol sighed. You're right. I'm going to have to make the phone call that I was dreading to have to make. But I have no choice in the matter now. Who are you going to phone? His relatives? No, I'm going to phone a nephew of his in Juneau, Alaska. Unfortunately, other members of Clayton Harrington's family have distanced themselves from him over the years. You know what families are like, how people fall out all the time. Clayton Harrington, well, when he was younger, could be rather prickly. Rub people up the wrong way. He still does, you know. Which was one of the reasons he soured his relationship with his extended family. Even his own brothers have been estranged from him for years. It's desperately sad. I mean, he's always been quite a hermit since Ginger died. But I know his nephew will make a plan. Maybe organize a full-time carer to move in with him, to take care of the man. It is sad, I agreed. I know, but we must remember age will afflict us all one day. I'm not getting any younger myself. Shall I make you some coffee, love, before I make that phone call? And how about something for breakfast? That would be lovely. A coffee and a piece of toast is more than enough for me, Carol. I'm not a big eater this early in the morning. Which explains why, my dear, you have such a lovely figure. I was so worried about meeting you. But I have to tell you, my next-door neighbour was right. She told me that I was bound to love you to pieces, as Lathan is such a good judge of character. And it seems she was not wrong. Ooh, something smells nice, said my fiancé, entering the kitchen, wearing shorts and a T-shirt, his hair ruffled, his eyes half open. You're smelling the toast I'm making for Debbie, said Carol. Would you like some, love? Or something more substantial, perhaps? Eggs and bacon? I'm quite happy to fry some up for you. Toast will be just fine, Mum. I'm not very hungry, said Lathan appreciatively, taking a seat at the kitchen table next to me. I was just saying, my dear, to your Debbie over here, how wonderful it is to finally meet her, and how glad I am that she's now part of our family. We were having a little tete-a-tete, talking about, you know, old Mr. Harrington from across the road. What about him? Asked Lathan, raising a quizzical brow. Was Debbie telling you about what happened yesterday, when we bumped into him? I don't think he knew who I was, Mum. He was saying some very weird stuff about big feet and about being followed. I couldn't understand what he was going on about. It was bizarre. It was like he was looking right through us and didn't even see us physically standing there. Yes, she told me all about your strange interaction. I'm afraid, love, it's time for me to call his nephew and Juno. Clayton Harrington is no longer capable of looking after himself. It's plain to see. But are you sure, Mum? I'm afraid so, love. There is no doubt. Debbie discovered him wandering around the woodgrove this morning. He was behaving very childishly. He didn't want to go home. I interceded. He thought I was your mother, I'm afraid. He was complaining about a yard shed that you broke when you were 10 years old. Can you believe that? That is not good news. Yes, I thought something was off about him yesterday, Lathan agreed. If he's like that, we really are going to have to call his nephew and Juno. He cannot possibly stay in that house unsupervised without any help. He'll be a danger to himself. Moments later, after Carol had made the much-needed phone call, she looked up at me and Lathan with a resolute expression on her face. I've done it, finally. So what did his nephew say? I asked. Well, unfortunately, he can't fly out here right away. He can only come here next week. He asked me to try and get a carer to move in with his uncle right away. He's willing to cover all the expenses and costs. He was grievously concerned about his uncle's strange behaviour, and how you, Debbie, saw him wandering around the grove this morning, mumbling to himself. He believes that if we take Clayton to a care home of some kind, that the man is going to kick up quite the fuss and refuse to go. And I agree with him wholeheartedly on that. The best option is to have someone staying on the property with him to take care of him. Clayton is fiercely independent, you see. He's always insisted in staying at that home. He told me he was going to die there, and that is that. He's got a couple of spare rooms in that property that will be suitable for the carer to stay in. Carol soon made some phone calls, and before long we organised a carer for Clayton. The woman was in her early 30s, and assured us she was very experienced and had worked with people who had Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We felt reasonably satisfied that she was experienced enough. When we arrived at Clayton Harrington's house to introduce him to the new carer, he appeared to be in good form, and was as sharp as a hawk. I remember thinking to myself that this is not the same man that I'd seen wandering around the wood grove, for he appeared so lucid.
Goodness gracious me, if it isn't Carol Huberger. This is a lovely surprise. It's very good to see you, Carol. And who do we have here?
He said, glancing at me and the carer. He gave us all a warm, sunny smile, and looked at me as if he'd never seen me a day in his life, with an inquiring gaze. Clayton Harrington appeared to have enjoyed a shave and a shower that morning. He was smartly attired, in chinos and a cool, crisp cotton shirt. There was nothing untoward about him that would suggest he was remotely senile. Even the carer, who was wearing a smart navy blue uniform, looked a tad surprised by Clayton's demeanour. I couldn't help but think she probably wondered what all the fuss was about, as this elderly man that she was supposed to care for looked to be of sound mind.
It's such a surprise, as I was saying, Carol, to see you, said Clayton. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Are you going to introduce me to your lovely friends?
Carol flushed red with embarrassment. I don't know if you've met Debbie Whitechapel. She's the young lady that I was telling you about. The lovely lady that is going to marry my son Lathan. Don't you remember? I was so surprised that there really was no recognition in Clayton Harrington's eyes. He took my hand in his, shaking it vigorously.
It's very good to meet you, Debbie Whitechapel. Lathan has done very well for himself indeed. You're very easy on the eye. I'm sure he's a very lucky man. And who is this young lady? Asked Clayton, looking at the carer. Lathan is not marrying two women, is he? He asked teasingly.
Carol flushed red with embarrassment. I don't know if you remember that I was telling you that my son's met a lovely young lady. This is Debbie Whitechapel. She's the lady that is going to marry Lathan. She's my new daughter-in-law.
Oh, yes, I seem to remember you telling me all about her. Whitechapel. Very interesting surname, I have to say. And it is delightful to meet you, Debbie.
I was surprised that there was absolutely no recognition in Clayton Harrington's eyes. He took my hand in his and shook it vigorously.
As I was saying, it's very good to meet you, Debbie. Lathan has done very well for himself, I have to say. You're easy on the eye. And who is this other young lady? Asked Clayton, looking inquiringly at the carer. Lathan is not marrying two women, is he? He asked teasingly.
Carol was looking rather awkward. Of course not, Clayton. As if my Lathan would ever do that. He's a one-woman man, and Debbie is all he wants. If you must know, this young lady here is called Cassie, Clayton. Your nephew has organized for Cassie to stay here with you for a while, to help you manage the house. Stuff like that, if you know what I mean. Clayton Harrington looked taken aback. He raised his brow.
But why would Levi hire someone to look after me? I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, you know.
Of course you are, Clayton. No one can disagree with that. It's just that Levi thought you should have someone help you spring clean your house, cook you a few nice meals. He says it's a gift from him to you, so to speak.
But why? It's not my birthday.
I think Levi misses you a lot. You know what he's like. He wanted to do something nice for you. So why not let him, Clayton? It's his privilege. He's obviously making money, and he just wanted to spoil you a bit. That's all.
Well, I suppose you better come in then, Cassie, said Mr. Harrington reluctantly. You might want to make a start on washing the curtains in the living room. They've been looking quite dowdy recently.
Cassie made a rather contorted, rather disapproving face. She knew she was not here to spring clean Clayton Harrington's house, but she seemed to fully understand the sensitivity of the awkward situation. So she gritted her teeth and gave the man a watery smile and said, "Well, I better get on with it, hadn't I?" Me and my fiancé decided to stretch out our stay with Carol beyond just a long weekend, as Lathan wanted to help her with sorting out the problem she had with Clayton Harrington, and I for one was glad to be staying a little longer. It would be the quintessential opportunity to get to know my mother-in-law better. Well, my future mother-in-law, that is. The following 2 days went rather well, although Cassie was telling us that there were times Mr. Harrington thought she was his wife Ginger, but she humoured him and went along with the charade. It was on the 4th night of my stay at Carol's house that me and Lathan woke up with a start. We could hear someone banging noisily on Carol's front door. Lathan and I hurled ourselves out of bed like 2 rockets in takeoff and hurried towards the front door. Lathan opened the door to a terrified-looking Cassie. She was out of breath, and for a brief moment nothing appeared to come out of her mouth, as if she'd simply lost the ability to speak. Her body was wobbling like a jelly, her face as white as a sheet. Lathan led her into the kitchen, insisting she take a seat, while he prepared her a measure of whiskey. "What's going on?" asked Carol, who had heard the commotion and come rushing into the kitchen, with Herbert cradled in her arms. "What on earth is going on? What was the awful commotion about?" Her eyes trailed over Cassie. "Is everything all right, Cassie? What on earth is going on? You look quite shaken, my dear. Your face is as white as a sheet. Are you all right?" Cassie was talking so fast, it was hard to make out what she was saying. I've never been so scared, Mrs. Huberger. You've no idea. It was staring at me through the window. I can't possibly go back in that house. I'm sorry, I just can't. There's no way I'm going back into that house. "Calm down, Cassie," said Carol, putting a reassuring, comforting arm around the woman's back and tapping it gently. "What on earth is going on, dear?" "I saw it, Mrs. Huberger. I saw it clearly. The moonlight lit the creature up. I could see him through the living room window, staring in at us. Oh, I've never been so terrified, Mrs. Huberger. You have no idea how big this thing was. When I say big, you have no idea. You have no idea." "Sorry, Cassie. What were you seeing staring at you through the window? Could you explain yourself a little better, perhaps? You've completely lost me, my dear." "It was a Bigfoot, Mrs. Huberger. A Bigfoot. I don't know how to tell you this, Mrs. Huberger, but it gets worse, because I couldn't stop him. Believe me, I tried to stop him. I tried, Mrs. Huberger. I knew it wasn't safe to go out of doors with that thing out there. But Mr. Harrington, he wouldn't listen to me. He ran out of the door, Mrs. Huberger, after the Bigfoot. Oh, I'm so sorry, but that thing is going to kill him. What are we going to do, Mrs. Huberger?" "Let's get this right, my dear. Now, I just want you to calm down. You saw a Bigfoot looking at you through the living room window. Is that right? Are you sure that that is what you were seeing? Could you not have been a little mistaken? Seen a shadow, perhaps? It's easy to happen, you know." "I promise you, Mrs. Huberger, there is no mistake. I saw a male Bigfoot. I know it was a male. I just know. Don't ask me how I know. I just know." "I need to ask you this, Cassie. Now, don't take offence to what I'm asking you, but have you been drinking on the job?" "No, of course not, Mrs. Huberger. I never ever drink. I know you must think I sound crazy, but I saw a Bigfoot. I'm not lying. And Mr. Harrington went after him. I'm worried about him, Mrs. Huberger. I couldn't stop him. He just bolted out of the door. It's going to kill him. I know it is. Oh, my God, it's so dangerous. What are we going to do?" "She probably did see a Bigfoot," I said so matter-of-factly that everybody turned around to look straight at me, as if I was speaking a foreign language. "Well, I've seen the Bigfoot myself, so I assure you Cassie is not making this up. She probably did see a male Bigfoot. He is a male." Lathan looked at me incredulously.
his jaw dropping wide open, his eyes widening. "You've seen a Bigfoot? You didn't think to tell me about this?"
"Well, I thought you'd think I was as mad as a March hare. I did see him in the wood grove, well, 3 mornings ago, actually, if you must know. But he is completely harmless."
"He's not harmless!" cried Cassie, her eyes growing wide with indignation. "You mark my words! That thing is a killing machine! It's got to be!"
"I assure you that Bigfoot is totally harmless. He looks very scary and intimidating, but I promise you he wouldn't harm a fly. I was terrified when I first encountered him myself, but believe it or not, he's benevolent. He was trying to help old Mr. Harrington back to his home. The Bigfoot was telling me that Mr. Harrington was very confused, that he was drifting between the astral world and our reality. He told me it was because he's not long for this earth. I think the Bigfoot has extrasensory perception." Carol was looking at me with an aghast expression on her face.
"You're telling me that the Bigfoot spoke to you? Is that what you're saying? How is that remotely possible?"
I nodded. "Carol, he spoke to me in a foreign language. I didn't understand what he was saying at first, but I promise you, suddenly every word made sense. It was like it was almost downloaded into my head, and I understood exactly what he was saying. The creature was only standing 2 feet away from me. He had the kindest eyes you've ever seen. If he wanted to harm me, he could have done so easily, without any problems, but he didn't. The trouble is he's such an intimidating-looking creature, your natural reaction is to be terribly afraid. But I promise you, he was just such an easy-going creature. Mr. Harrington is safe, but we should probably go after him, because he's very disorientated and confused, and I suspect the Bigfoot was just checking up on him."
"I don't care if that creature is benevolent or not, as you say. I'm still not going anywhere near those woods. The size of that thing! It was an absolute monster, the most intimidating thing I've ever seen, and I'm sorry, I still believe he's dangerous."
"Well, I'll go and get Mr. Harrington," I said.
"You can't go after him," said Lathan. "It's dangerous."
"No, it's not," I said, screwing up my face. "I told you, the Bigfoot's absolutely harmless. I encountered the creature. I stood 2 feet away from him. I was telling you that. If he wanted to harm me, he could have done so, but he didn't." Lathan did not look convinced, and insisted on arming himself with his late father's rifle, but we both went into the wood grove together after Mr. Harrington. It was a dark, inauspicious night, but thankfully both me and Lathan were wearing flashlights on our heads, so we could see relatively well.
"I hope you know what you're doing, Debbie," said Lathan. "I feel very uneasy about all of this."
"Everything will be absolutely fine," I assured him, but Lathan continued to look unconvinced. His hands were trembling on his rifle. I don't think he relished the prospect of an encounter with a Bigfoot. We ambled down the path and could hear a conversation taking place, and when the light of Lathan's torch illuminated the Bigfoot that was talking to Mr. Harrington, Lathan shrank back in horror, terror etched on his face. We could hear Mr. Lathan saying,
"What do you mean by saying goodbye? I want to come with you."
When the Bigfoot saw me, there was relief on his face. Lathan froze to the spot as the Bigfoot moved towards us, but Lathan thankfully stood his ground.
"Kila kikwasi, ha kilaniko, hatilani kasapani, hoshaki sakwa." "I'm very glad you've come. Do you think you can get the man back to his house? I'm afraid when he saw me at the window, he came out after me. That was not my intention. I just came to say goodbye. He is departing from the earth plane tomorrow. I came to bid him farewell. His time on this earth is over."
"But how could you possibly know this?" I asked. "How can you tell?"
"Well, his energy has changed, hasn't it? He's wearing that green colour on his body. It's becoming increasingly subdued, growing fainter and fainter. It means his time is almost up."
Lathan didn't say anything to the Bigfoot, but I knew by his body language that he had understood the Bigfoot's every word. He was breathing more easily, as if he was more comfortable in the Bigfoot's company. The Bigfoot had seen his rifle, but did not react to it negatively. Instead, he said,
Kila kwasa, don't be afraid of me, man. There are monsters out there you need to be fearful of. Some of them are of your own kind, but let me assure you, I am not one of them. Kila tina kwasinaka, hila tila nopo. Sometimes the scariest things, I'm afraid, are wrapped up in the most benign parcels. Hila kinakwa, hoshaki salakati lanako, ha kilaniba. I might look intimidating, but I'm a pussycat, really.
All Lathan could do was nod, as if he understood the meaning of the Bigfoot's words. Don't worry, I told him. We'll get Mr. Harrington back to the house.
Iman tilaki. I'm much obliged, said the Bigfoot. I probably should not have come to say goodbye, kila tila puno. But I've grown rather fond of the old man. It seemed wrong not to wish him all the best. But he's awfully confused. He's going to a very happy place, you know, much better than here. And his wife is waiting for him.
We watched the Bigfoot gliding into the woods, and Lathan looked at me with bright gleaming eyes.
Well, I never. I've seen everything now, he said.
It was quite a performance getting Mr. Harrington to go back to his house. Once again he had absolutely no clue who I was. He didn't appear to recognize Lathan either. But I told him we needed to hurry back to his house, and he made quite a scene about it, as if he was still hankering after the Bigfoot. He kept saying he didn't want to go home. Even Lathan was surprised by Clayton Harrington's juvenile antics. I cunningly told the old man that he needed to hurry home at once, as Lathan Huberger was going to pay for the repairs to his yard shed window.
About time, too. What's wrong with the boy? That bill has been outstanding for quite some time.
We led Lathan Harrington back home. I prepared him some tea and toast, while the old man fell asleep on the sofa. But when I tried to rouse him, I realized he'd passed away. He looked incredibly peaceful, and I realized the Bigfoot really had come to say goodbye to the old man, as it was Mr. Harrington's time to go. I marvelled that the Bigfoot knew this. I walked away from Mr. Harrington's house, filled with an incredible sense of peace. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.